I've been asked to put together an instructional video to accompany the written rules because I know a lot of people prefer to watch a video where they can see the game illustrated as opposed to merely reading through a rules manual. And my rules manual does not have a lot of graphics and illustrations, and it would be very lengthy if I did. So I want to walk through the whole process, the whole game for you. And this is not going to be a fancy high-tech video, just a simple explanation of how to play. Let's start at the very beginning when you get the game for the very first time. Now, in my game, there are two versions of the game. The first would be the deluxe version, and when you get the game and you open it, first thing you notice is that the lid is a very snug and tight fit. And that can be a little annoying working it off, but that's a good thing. It means the lid will never accidentally fall off and all your parts fall over the place. First thing you'll see is a folder with some of the various score sheets in there. And the next thing you'll see are the bags with the little cubes in here. And these cubes represent individual infantry troops. So you'll take a bag of cubes and one of the small trays that you can see corresponds in color. And these are all the individual player pieces. So you'll take one of these plastic trays and the cubes and give that to the various players and sort them out like that. Once you get out all of the different cubes and player pieces, then the next thing that you'll see would be a larger compartmentalized storage tray with all of the general player components and pieces that to be used in the process of the game, various types of cards and other components. And then finally at the bottom you would have the game board. Now there are two maps. There is an optional alternate map that some people like to get, but most folks will just have the original regular map. And this will be at the bottom of the box. And as just a tip, I recommend that when you store the game, you always put the map in first in the bottom of the box, because you know cardboard maps can warp over time, especially in high humidity conditions. And by putting it in the bottom of the box with everything else on top of it, that weight and the pressure of the box keeps it flat where it cannot warp. The board is a 6-fold board. And that's why it can fit in the box. You'll want to handle it gently as you seek to unfold it. So, if you have the deluxe version of the game, this is what you get when you open the box. On the other hand, if rather than getting the deluxe version, you order the regular version of the game, that means it will not be ready to play right out of the box, but you'll need to take an hour or two initially to get the game all ready and set up to play, organized the way you like it for the first time. So this is what it will look like if you get the regular version of the game. You open it up and you'll see various packs of the cards that you'll need to go through and organize and sort these. You will see the various bags of the infantry cubes and dice in the different colors. A few other little miscellaneous general game components. And then a number of components that will need to be punched out. You'll see there are a bunch of these different cards, and this is one of the reasons it takes a while. It's a lot that you've got to punch out, and then you've got to organize them. All of the individual player components you can see in all the different colors here that will need to be punched. Inside the folder, along with the score sheets, you will find one laminated sheet with game components. These are components that you'll need to cut out. So rather than punching them out, you'll have to cut them out with scissors. And then these will all be folded after the fashion of paper tents that you could set up on the board. The only thing here that you would not fold would be these 4 components here. These represent bridges. You simply cut them out, and when you use these, they lie flat on the board. Whereas these factories and these nuclear weapons plants and these mountains are all cut and folded in half. And finally, again, at the bottom of the box, you'll see the game board. It's, again, a 6-fold board that you'll open up. So once you've punched out all of the various components and worked all the cards and organized them, then you'll be ready to play. Let me mention one thing in particular with the various cards, especially these cards that are blue in color, called strategy cards. There are a lot of these, 192 of these. These will come from the manufacturer with all of like cards or similar cards all grouped or clustered together. So the very first time you play the game, you will want to shuffle these cards very thoroughly. And after you've done that the first time, just some moderate shuffling, of course, before all future games. But the very first time, you're going to really need to take some time to be sure that you separate them. Because if you've got cards where there are, say, 10 or 14 of a certain type, all 10 or 14 are just going to be clustered together as they come to you. Let's take a moment briefly to identify the individual player components. Starting in the upper left corner, you're going to have the circles that are numbered 0 through 5, and these represent generals. We'll talk about how to utilize those at a later point. Next to that, you're going to have 6 bombers, and these are easily identified because most of the components are actually labeled. Next to that, you're going to have 6 fighters, and then you're going to have your 8 heavy artillery units and 8 battleships. And then you have 2 sets of units with either a number 3 or 5 on them. There are 10 of each. These simply represent higher quantities of infantry. So the cubes represent single infantry units, but the board can get a little crowded at times. And so for convenience sake, we've got these to represent higher quantities of infantry on the board. Next, you're going to have the token that represents your headquarters, only one of those. You're also going to have a token that represents civilians, and you want to be aware that if you flip this over, on the back side it says human shield. And in the course of the game, it will either, of course, be placed with one side or the other up, depending on what you choose, whether they're just civilians or if you're going to use them as a human shield. And then you've got 2 tokens that represent your POW camp. You're also going to have 3 6-sided dice and 3 8-sided dice, and then 1 additional 6D dice that is a different color than your other dice. And this die will function as a 7-sided dice. There are actually such things as 7D dice, but they're very awkward and expensive. So instead, we simply incorporate one of these in the game. So when you use this different color dice, it is a 7D die. And the way that works is anytime that you happen to roll a 1 here, that will count as a 7. So that your options are rolling a 2 through 7 instead of a 1 through 6. And that's pretty much it for the individual player components. Now let's take a moment to identify the components in the general components tray. There are 192 of the blue colored cards. These are called strategy cards, and they do all kinds of different things. These are purchased during the course of the game, and we'll talk more about these and how to use these going forward. Again, we just want to identify the components at this part. You're going to have a stack of these cards that are referred to as raw material cards. They're labeled right on the front of the card. You have the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse cards. Then you're going to have a stack of cards that are stock certificates. You're going to have 40 of these labeled years 1 through 4 and 10 of each for each year. The brown cards are the territory cards. There's 1 labeled for each territory on the board. Then you're going to have your currency units, and currency units come in quantities of either 1 or denominations of 1 or 5. Then it is here also that you're going to find the industrial centers, and every industrial center is either going to have on it a 1 or a 2. And there are 12 industrial centers, 6 with a 1 and 6 with a 2 on them. These are some of the items that you cut out if you don't get the deluxe version of the game, and you can see how you just simply fold them and make paper tents out of them, and then you can just set it down on the board like that. You're going to have also in here 15 mountains, so these are your mountains. These are raw material markers or tokens. Now here we have raw material cards. These you would hold in your hand. These are raw materials tokens, and these will be on the map. Next you have 5 of these little plastic buildings, and these represent sites of historic significance on the board. So 5 of those. Next you'll have 5 of these top secret tokens. They say top secret on the back. If you flip it over, it will have something written on it that represents a resource that you have that are on the map that nobody knows you have because you put it down on the board face down. Only you know what is written there. So when you have one of these on the board, that means other players know you have some kind of military resource on the board, but they don't know what it is. They only know you have it. You will have one 10-sided die that is rarely needed in the game, so there's just one that's available in the general tray. You have 3 nuclear weapons plants. Again, these are paper tents that are set up on the board. And along with these, you're going to have 3 radioactivity tokens. It's written on the back, says radiation, do not enter. It's just the symbol on the front. Then you're going to have a stack of 48 missiles that are in 3 different colors. The blue ones would be blue range missiles, and all of them have writing on the back. You'll have a number of red missiles, and finally you'll have a number of these white or gray missiles. Then there is a large slot in the tray where you can store pens for all the players. So you don't have to round these up every time you go to play the game. But also in this long slot is where the bridges are stored for the game. So you've got 4 bridges, 2 short ones, and 2 somewhat longer bridges. So this is just identifying all of the various game components for you. All right, now let's talk briefly about the board, just to orient you to the map that is used in this game. On the left side of the board would be 7 different countries, each represented by different colors. You can see the red country, the yellow country, the gray, and so forth. Each of these countries is further subdivided into territories. So the red country consists of 8 different territories, or you've got here the yellow country that is subdivided into 6 different territories. On the right side of the map are a series of islands, and you can easily recognize the islands because they're all some shade of violet. And for a point of clarification, this island here is considered an island, even though technically it is adjacent to what we could call the mainland red territory. But because it has that slight violet color, you know it's an island. The same would go true here. Now, the islands, like the countries, are also subdivided into territories. Most of the islands are a little smaller than the countries, consisting of 2 to 3 territories per island. Whereas the countries are going to have 5 to 8 territories per country. Furthermore, you'll note that in each of the countries and in each of the islands, there is a circle with a number in it, and that circle represents the point value that a player gets if he controls all of the territories in that particular country or that island. Now, a key aspect of the map that you'll need to understand is that the map is viewed as wrapping from the left side all the way over here to the right side. So that actually the far left side of the board here is considered adjacent to the far right side of the board. And in order to help the player be sure of which water territories or land territories here are considered adjacent to the left side of the board, they are actually labeled here with the name of the territories to which they are adjacent. In other words, if you look at these 3 water territories, they each have the name of the territory called Minkata, which is this territory way over here. So these 3 water territories are considered actually adjacent to this land territory because the board wraps around. Likewise, these next 2 water territories are labeled Takum, which lets you know that they're actually considered adjacent to this territory of Takum. This island here actually is adjacent to the land territory of Takum, and this island territory, Telekin, is considered adjacent to this country territory of Tabin. So you just always have to bear in mind that you can actually get from this side of the board all the way over here immediately because they are considered adjacent. But the same principle does not work vertically. That is, the top of the board does not wrap around and have any connection with the bottom of the board. It just goes from the two sides. All right, let's talk about how you win the game. The basic object of the game is to have the highest score after 5 game years. And a year in the game consists of anywhere from 1 to 10 rounds. And points are awarded based upon the following elements. First of all, controlling all of an entire country or island. We talked about that. The number in the circle represents how many points you'd get. If you control, for example, all of the yellow, you'd get the 7 points. Secondly, the total number of individual territories that you control divided by 2, but rounded up. So you don't have to control every territory of a certain color in order to be getting points. You just add up all of the individual territories, and then you would divide that by 2. Next, there would be the point values of the various industrial centers. Again, you recall that there are 2 types of industrial centers, those with a 1 on them and those with a 2 on them, and those represent the number of points that you would get at the end of the game for each of those that you control. Number 4, you would add up the total number of infantry and military hardware that you have. This would include your heavy artillery units, your fighter jets, your bombers, your battleships, and the missiles that you own. You get 1 point for each one of those items that you have on the board at the end of the game. And then finally, there might be some bonus points that you would add in, or some penalties that would be applied to your final score that you would have to subtract. For example, if you had been charged with a war crime during the course of the game, depending on what the war crime was, that would represent a penalty off of your final score that you would then have to back that off of the score. All right, now let's talk about the initial setup of the game. 1 player will be designated as the treasurer. The treasurer will distribute to each player his tray of individual player components and a bag of corresponding cubes that represent his individual infantry units. In addition to that, he'll distribute to each player 1 score sheet. Now, the score sheet is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, but you can see it's designed so that it conveniently folds in half. On one side is where he will actually keep the track of his score throughout the game and calculate eventually his final score. He can flip it over during the course of the game, and he will find a basic guide that reminds him of the various items and pieces of military hardware that he can purchase and the cost of purchasing these various things. A little information that reminds him about the various missiles, what they cost, and what they do. And then there's a basic reminder of the basic sequence of turn actions. So right here is a real handy sheet that the player has with him at all times. And pretty much this is everything he needs to know. Now, if you open the sheet, on the inside you'll find specific information about how to use the general, which is not always used by every player in every game, and also some information about what happens when you capture an enemy's headquarters. And so that information is on the inside. This is information that you need to refer to less often. That's why it stays on the inside of the sheet. You can just pop it open if you need to look at that for reference. But very frequently during the game, the players are either going to be looking at this side of the sheet that basically gives him all the key military components and what they cost and what they do, or he's going to flip it to this side to be calculating his score. After each player has been distributed these components by the treasurer, then the treasurer will set up the map. Excuse me. Now the map is randomly set up each time you play with various components that give the game a very different flavor, and this is going to require different strategies every time you play it because of the randomness. And the way that this is accomplished is the treasurer will take out the brown deck of territory cards, shuffle them, and set them face down in front of him, and then he will get out of the general component of the general tray of game components, these 4 items. He will get the 15 mountains, the 12 factories, the 12 raw materials tokens, and the 5 sites of historic significance. And now that the deck has been thoroughly shuffled, he will simply turn over the first card, and whatever territory is represented on this card, then he will take the mountain, the first line in the row here, and he will place that on it. So in this case, it was the territory of Iskar, so a mountain goes on there, and that means Iskar is a mountainous territory. Then he returns to the brown deck of territory cards, flips over the next card in the sequence. This one says Ishden, so he'll go to the second item in the row, which would be the factories, take off the top factory, and simply place it here on the territory of Ishden. Returning to the deck, he flips over the next card. It's the territory of Alamu. He takes the third item in the row, which would be a raw materials tokens, takes the first one off the top of the deck, and places it right there on the territory of Alamu. Returns to the deck. Turns over the next card, territory of Shanku, so he takes the last item in the row, these sites of historic significance, and simply places any one of these. The color doesn't really matter. They're all different colors, but you just grab one and put it on there. That means there's a site of historic significance there. Then he starts the process all over again. You return to the deck, continue to turn over the next card, returning to the beginning of the row, placing a mountain on the on the board based on the designated territory. Now, of course, you will run out of historic sites more quickly than the other items because there are only 5, but you just keep going down the row like this until everything has been placed on the board. And by the time you are done with your process, you might have a board that would look something like this. All of the raw materials and mountains and factories have just been randomly placed across the board. And so the first thing players start doing is examining the map to see how it turned out this time as they start thinking about a potential strategy. Here are some of the types of things that would catch a player's attention. You look at the green territories and you notice there happen to be a lot of mountains in here. Mountains are easy to hold and defend, so that catches one's attention. Something that would especially catch my attention is the fact that the blue territories have 3 factories that ended up inside of the blue territories, which means that if I could control all of the blue territories, I would have a lot of points coming in, because in addition to getting the usual 8 points for controlling all the blue territories, I would also control the territories that have these 3 factories. 2 of these, you can see, are 2-point factories, so that's an additional 5 points. Meaning that if I controlled all of the blue territories, I would have the 8 for the territories plus the 5 for the factories. That's 13 points. In this game, that is a lot of points. So that would be catching my eye. Again, this is entirely random. Sometimes it doesn't turn out that way at all. So, for example, down here in the red, it's also normally worth 8 points, but you'll notice not a single factory ended up in any of the red territories. So the red country is a little less valuable in this particular game because it didn't get many factories. Or examine the island here. Islands are usually small and a little easier to hold than the mainland countries. This island, if you get it normally, is worth only 3 points, and that's not so much. But because it ended up with 2 2-point factories, if I controlled all 4 of these territories, I would get a total of 3 points plus 4 points, and that would be 7 points. So that really catches my attention. That little island is a quite valuable piece of real estate in this particular game. And 7 points is pretty good just for controlling 4 territories. So this is the initial setup phase of the game. Now the next step in the process is for players to populate the map with the cubes that represent their individual infantry units. And the number of infantry with which they start the game varies depending upon how many players are in the game. You can see from the rules manual how it's spelled out. If there are 5 players, each one starts out with 25 infantry. 4 players, you each start with 30. With 3 players, you each start with 35. And then with 2 players, there are special rules. You can read the special rules in that section of the rules manual that will spell that out, how to do that. So what the player will do is he will get his bag of units and he will simply count out that many. Let's say there are 5 players. You're going to count out 25 of these cubes and set them aside. Now, if you are familiar with the territory grab approach toward playing Risk, then you'll understand how we proceed next. We will populate the map by having each player roll his 3 6-sided dice, and whoever achieves the highest total with his 3 dice begins, and then play will work its way around the table to his left. That first player with the highest number would take one of his cubes, and he would claim any one of the main country territories that he wishes. It doesn't matter if there are mountains or factories or raw materials on there. He simply decides that, hey, I'm going to claim this territory, and so he puts his cube on there. And then the player to his left will take one of the remaining country territories, and he will claim that by putting his cube on that territory. And so it works all the way around the table till everybody's placed one cube on, and then you're back to the first player in the sequence. He then will claim another territory that has not yet been claimed. The key point is, of course, that you cannot put that cube on a territory that already has another cube on it. We're going to put only one cube on each territory until all of the main country territories have been claimed. Now, it is important to note that we are speaking here only about country territories. At this stage of the game, players cannot put any of their cubes on any of these island territories. These will be left entirely vacant. And so we start out the game with none of these territories being claimed. Instead, it will be during the course of the game that the players will have to invest in battleships and go out to sea and claim those territories. Now, there is one special rule for 3 or 5 players that is referenced on page 34 of the rules manual. In the case of 3 players, what will happen is the first player will get to claim one less territory than the other 2 players. That is because the number of territories is not evenly divided by 3. The easiest way to keep track of this, as the rules manual spells out, is that the first player in the sequence will take his initial quantity of cubes. Let's say they would have each had 35 infantry with 3 players. So out of that initial 35 that he pulled out of the bag, he will set aside 14 cubes, reminding him he will only be able to claim 14 territories here at the beginning of the game. The other 2 players will set aside 15 cubes out of that initial 35 as a reminder that they'll each get to claim 15 territories. Correspondingly, if there are 5 players in the game, everybody starts out with 25 cubes. The first player will set aside out of that 25 8 cubes, reminding him that he can claim only 8 territories, while the remaining 4 players will all set aside 9 cubes as a reminder that they can claim 9 territories. And by the time then the first player has claimed his 8 territories and the other 4 have claimed all 9 territories, you would then find every single country territory now being claimed and all the islands being vacant. Now, once all of the territories have been claimed, each player will still have some remaining cubes from his initial quantity. Again, with 5 players, you started out with 25. So if you had claimed 9 territories, you're still going to have 16 infantry cubes left over. At this point, players continue working their way in sequence around the board, now fortifying territories that they have already claimed and fortifying in quantities of 5. The 5 don't have to go all on the same territory. They can split them up. So of his remaining 16, he would take 5 of these and say he could put all 5 of them right there in that territory. Or alternatively, he might only put 2 onto that territory, and then this other territory is where he would put the remaining 3. So he can split them up however he wants, simply adding them to territories he had already claimed. And then the next player will put on 5, and the next player, and around you'll go until finally these cubes have all been used up. Now, of course, again, we don't have an even quantity of 5 left. So at the end, the last time around, he's only going to have 1 with which to fortify, but he goes ahead and takes the last cube and puts it on again, whatever territories are under his control, simply to fortify that territory. So once every player has placed all of his cubes on the board, we are now officially ready to play. Now at this point, the treasurer will ask each player to remove from his bag of infantry cubes 1 cube and hands it to the treasurer, who will hold them momentarily. And at this point, each player will now roll 3 6-sided dice. And based upon what he rolls at this point, this will determine turn order for the rest of the game. So the turn order that was used to populate the map is not the permanent turn order. This means that when you were placing your cubes on the map to claim territories, you were doing so without any knowledge of what the ultimate turn order would be. Only after the map has been fully populated will everybody then roll, and this will now determine the permanent turn order. So you rolled 3 6-sided dice, and turn order now goes based on the highest rolls to the lowest roll. So unlike a lot of games where you find an initial player and then play just goes around the table from his left in the sequence in which players are seated around the table, it is not based upon where you're seated around the table, but based upon what you roll. So once everybody has rolled, then the treasurer takes the cube that was handed to him by each player out of his bag and lines these cubes up along the edge of the board in the sequence in which the players rolled. So for example, the highest roll was the yellow player. He's at the front of the line. Green had the second highest number, blue the third highest number. And so this line of cubes along the edge of the board serves throughout the game as a visual reminder of turn order for everybody, since it doesn't just go in the order in which you're seated around the table. All right, we've said that the game consists of 5 years, and the goal is to have the highest score after the 5 years. A year in the game consists of 3 key stages. There will be the pre-attack phase, secondly, the attack phase, and third, the post-attack phase. Once the map has been populated and turn order has been determined for the rest of the game, we officially enter into the game at the beginning of year 1. And here at the beginning of year 1, you begin with the pre-attack phase. And what happens during the pre-attack phase is that players will get a chance to determine how many points they have achieved at this point in the game. And based upon those point totals, they will get reinforcements and they will get currency that will enable them to buy various pieces of military hardware and strategic options. Now, this is where the score sheet comes in handy. So for example, at this point, we're at the beginning of year 1. So the player takes his score sheet and he uses this as a guide, and he can simply add up his points. You see, first of all, he determines the number of country bonus points. That would be the number represented in the circle. If a player controls all of the territories in that particular color, then he would get that number in the circle. The second thing he does is he adds up the points for his industrial centers. Again, that's going to be like a 1 for this one, plus 2 for this one, and 2 for that one. That would be a total of 5 points, so he would write a 5 on the score sheet. The third thing that he will do is add up the total number of territories under his control and divide that by 3. Now, this number must be totally and fully divisible by 3, with one caveat, that all players will always get a minimum of 3 in that blank. But if he can get it above and beyond, he will. For example, if he has claimed 12 territories, well, you divide that by 3 and you're now up to 4 points. If he had claimed 15 territories, well, you divide that by 3 and you get up to 5, and so he would write a 5 in that blank. So then you take the 3 numbers, the number for the country bonus points, the number for your industrial centers, total number of territories divided by 3, and you get a total number. And the score sheet here will remind you that the total number of points you come up with represents how many reinforcements you get. And the reinforcements would be represented in terms of cubes representing individual infantry units. So for example, if the number here is 10, then at this point I would count out 10 cubes out of my bag, and that means I've just gained myself an additional 10 infantry units. In addition to getting those 10 cubes, I take half of that number, half of this number, and that's how much currency I get, and this number would be rounded up. So for example, if the number here were 9, well, divide that in half, that's 4.5, which would round up to 5. So then in addition to getting 9 infantry cubes, I would get 5 currency units. So the treasurer makes sure that everyone is distributed the currency that he needs to get from the general player components tray, and then each player counts out his own infantry cubes from his bag of cubes. Now at this point, if the player flips over his score sheet, he will find a reminder of the sequence of turn actions during each phase of the year. First, there is the pre-attack phase. And the first thing that he will do is place his new infantry reinforcements that he just counted out of the bag on his territories. And you'll note that these actions are taken in order from the last player in the sequence to the first player. So remember how we had determined a turn sequence and represented with the cubes along the side of the board. Now the yellow was the highest roller. He's in first place, green second, and the blue here, of course, is in last place. But blue will actually be the first player to reinforce. So if he had gotten 9 cubes out of his bag, at this point he will take these 9 cubes and he will begin reinforcing territories that are under his control. So he's just beefing up territories that he needs to protect or from which he might want to launch an attack. So he puts his reinforcements on. And then the next in sequence would be the green. So the green player gets out his cubes and he puts his cubes on the board. Following the yellow player, he's at the front of the line, but he's going last, putting his reinforcements on the board. And this actually works to the advantage of the first player in the line, because this means that before he has to commit any reinforcements to the board, he's got already to have seen where all the other players have placed their reinforcements. So that's already going to give him a clue or a hint as to what the other players may be thinking about doing based upon where they put their troops on the board. So it works to his advantage that he actually goes last. Now then, after placing their reinforcements on the board, the score sheet will remind you that the next thing that the player will do is he will now take the currency units that he got and he will make purchases with them. And that's where the rest of this side of the score sheet is helpful. It tells them all the items that he can purchase and how many currency units he will need to purchase those. So a strategy card, for example. The strategy cards are the blue cards. They cost 1 currency unit, and he can purchase a maximum of 4 per year. Or he could buy a fighter jet. Those cost 1 currency unit. A bomber costs 2 currency units. A stock certificate, 2 currency units. A battleship, 3 currency units. Heavy artillery, 4 currency units. And a nuclear weapons plant component would be 4 currency units. It's also got the cost of missiles here. So everything he needs to know about what he can purchase is right here as a reminder for him. And so now the last player in the sequence makes his purchases. Then the next player in the sequence with his purchases. And finally, the guy who was first in the line is the last one to make his purchases. And once again, by going last, he's had the opportunity to see what other purchases other players have made. That gives him, again, a clue about what purchases they might be making. All right, at this point, all players have got reinforcements and put them on the board. All players have made purchases of various components of the game. The third step of the pre-attack phase now is to play any of the blue strategy cards that players may have if they purchased any such cards. And they might not have purchased any. But if they had, they might be able to play some now. Now, not all cards can be played at this stage of the game. Some of them can. So he would look through the cards that he had purchased, and if he has a card that is labeled pre-attack phase, well, that's where we are in the game, so this would be his opportunity now to play it. So at this point, he can play any pre-attack phase cards that he has and that he wishes to play. Again, he doesn't have to play them. He could keep them in his hand, planning to use them during the pre-attack phase of one of the other years. We're just at year 1. And again, these cards, if they're going to be played, again, they're played in sequence. The last player and the second player and finally the first player. Now in this case, this usually works to the advantage to the player who's last in line. So being last has its benefits. And the reason for that is if you become familiar with the cards, you'll know that it's usually best to play your cards at this stage of the game before the other players play theirs. For example, there are cards in the deck that allow you to steal cards or make players discard some of the cards that are in your hand. And so you want to get rid of your cards before another player gets the opportunity to steal your cards or make you discard them. So getting to play your cards first ends up being an advantage. So there are advantages to being both first in the line and at the end of the line. I should mention that if a player purchases these blue strategy cards, he must keep them face down. The content of these cards must be kept secret. He cannot tell other players what cards he has. That's not an option to tell other players, except in the rare instance where he is trying to negotiate a deal that involves trading one of his cards to another player. Obviously, in that case, he's going to have to identify to that particular player what card it is he wishes to give him. Other than that, they've got to be kept face down and kept secret from the other players. Okay, so we are now done with the pre-attack phase because each player has got reinforcements and placed them on the board. Secondly, he has gotten currency units and spent those buying things. And thirdly, any players that had any of the blue strategy cards and were qualified and wish to play them at this point have done so. So the pre-attack phase is done. Now we progress into step 2, the attack phase, which is really the heart and soul of the game. During the attack phase, the player will be entitled on each round of his turn to take one primary action and any number of secondary actions to which he is entitled. Let's talk about primary actions. There are 2 primary actions available to the player, and he will choose one or the other. The first is the simplest, and that would just be a troop movement. So on his turn, he could make a simple troop movement, which would involve moving some ground forces, like these infantry troops here in this territory, over to an adjacent territory that is currently under his control. Now, he would have to leave at least one unit behind because players can never willingly abandon a territory and leave it totally vacant of his troops. But he could move over troops to one adjacent territory, and that's it. He has made a troop movement. Now, you can see that's a very small movement, but that's his primary action for the turn. And because the game progresses like this, where he does that, and that's his primary action, and then the next player will get his turn, and he will do his primary and secondary actions. What this means is that the game progresses fairly quickly in bite-sized movements. So it's not 100% real-time, but it gives a close feel to being real-time, because for every simple move you make on the board, like you just moved some troops, then each of the other players will have a chance to go around the board, and they'll get a chance to do something, perhaps responding to the move you just made. This is not like Risk, for example, where you sit and wait while a player attacks and conquers a territory, then he goes and attacks another territory and another territory and another territory, and his turn just goes on forever with attack after attack after attack, and you're sitting there waiting forever for him to finish his turn. In this case, the player does a simple troop movement, and that's his primary action. Now, the other primary action that is an option available to him is, rather than doing a troop movement, he could do an attack. And when doing an attack, he would designate one and only one territory under the control of an opponent that will be the objective of his attack. Now, anything that is in that territory is subject to be the focus of his attack. So let's take this case, for example. Let's say it is Red's turn, and Red has announced that it wants to attack Blue here in this territory of Vader here. Now, there are 2 types of targets here. There's what are called a military target, which would be his infantry troops, but there's also what's called a strategic target, which would be the factory. And so he could either go for the factory, or he could announce that he is going for the troops here. Now, he can attack both because they're all in the same territory, and it's one territory that he wants to go after, but he just needs to clarify at any given point, what are you attacking right now, my strategic target, or are you going after my military forces? Most of the time, you'll be attacking military forces and leaving a factory intact, because you usually want to try to conquer those factories or industrial centers. Now, when we say that he can attack only one territory, there's one objective, but he can come at that territory from multiple locations and directions on the map and utilizing multiple means. For example, in the case of a ground attack, infantry forces can only attack adjacent territories. But you'll note that the red player here has multiple territories that are adjacent to this one blue territory. So red announces attack against Vador. Well, he might begin by attacking from this adjacent territory called Vandazia here. So he could attack from here. And if that attack doesn't go so well, then he might switch and say, okay, I've got a few forces here, so now I'll start attacking from here, this adjacent territory called Aziv. Or he might say, you know what, the next throw of the dice is going to come from here. I'm attacking from this territory that's also adjacent to it. So he could be attacking from 3 different places. Now we'll explain going forward about the concept of attacking from a distance by air, but bombers and fighters have range, so over several territories the red player has a bomber, and he could even fly the bomber over and say, hey, I'm attacking with this bomber in the territory of Vador. Bombers don't have to attack adjacent territories the way infantry do, so he could even be attacking using a bomber. So different means of attack. He could attack with bombers, he could attack with fighters, he could be attacking with missiles, so different vehicles of attack, different places from the attack. The key is there's always one objective that he has identified. This territory, and whatever is in this territory is what I can attack. I can attack your factory, or I can attack your land forces. So again, a primary action consists of either a troop movement or one territory that you've identified as the objective that you're going to attack. After you do that one primary action, then you can take any number of secondary actions that you wish to take, and the rules manual spells these out. Secondary actions would be things like playing, again, these blue strategy cards. There are some blue strategy cards. If you look at the deck of the cards, you'll see that some of them are labeled attack phase. And since we are now in the attack phase, this is when the player might be able to play an attack phase card. And so a secondary action would be playing one of these blue cards. It might involve cashing in a stock certificate. It might involve negotiating a trade with another player, some components. And so he can take as many secondary actions as he wishes, but only one primary action on the board. And so when he's done with his primary action and he's done any number of secondary actions like making a trade, playing a card, and so forth, then play will go to the next player in the sequence. Now in this case, once we have gotten into the attack phase, an important observation about turn sequence. During the pre-attack phase, we were going from the last player to the first player. But now in the attack phase, that will be reversed. We will now go in sequence from the first player down to the last player. So yellow would do his primary and then secondary actions. Green would do primary and secondary actions, and then blue. Now it's also important to observe that primary and secondary actions can be done in any order the player wishes. So for example, a player might have a strategy card that's designated for the attack phase that he plays first. Then after playing that card and resolving it, he might do an attack on the board as his primary action. And then after that battle, he might come back and play another blue strategy card. So anytime you play a strategy card, that's considered a secondary action. But you see how we mix this up. It's not all secondary actions and all primary, and then your primary action, or vice versa. You can mix it up. You could do a secondary action, then your primary action, then another secondary action. Or do your primary action, and then 2 or 3 secondary actions. The order doesn't matter. It's just that you have to limit it to the one primary action. And then that's it for that round of play. And as we said, next player then gets to do his primary action and his choice of secondary actions. Now, once we have gone all the way around and each player has had a chance to do one primary action and his choice of secondary actions, and we've worked all the way through the sequence, that completes 1 round of play. At this point, the process starts over again, and we go into the second round. Again, the first player in the sequence doing 1 primary action, whatever secondary actions, and then the next player, and so forth. Now, a year will consist of anywhere from 1 to 10 rounds like that. Well, how many rounds are in a year? Well, that's going to vary every year and every game because that is determined solely by the player who is in the first position in the line that particular year. So right now, for example, the yellow player is the first player, so it is his choice how many rounds the year is going to last. That makes being the first player in the line, who we call the lead player, a very powerful position. It's a very powerful advantage, getting to determine just how many rounds will be in the year and how long it's going to last. Now, he doesn't have to announce or tell the players how many rounds he wants to keep it open. That's up to him. It has to be a minimum of 1 complete round, a maximum of 10. But if he wants it to be 7, 8, 9, 10 rounds, whatever, that's all his choice. But he doesn't have to tell players in advance. So it could just be, you've gone through, you've only done 3 rounds, and all of a sudden, to everybody's surprise, he up and announces, that's it, the year is over. In this game, lying and backstabbing is just a part of the game, and so he could also be deceptive. He might announce to players at the beginning of the year that he plans to make this a fairly short year, only 2 or 3 rounds, but then after only 1 round, he announces that's it, the year's over. And so he told everybody it was going to be maybe 3 or 4 rounds, maybe, but then he limits it to only 1 round. He basically was lying to players, making them think that they would have more time and more options available during the course of the year. So that's entirely his choice if he wants it to be a long year or a short year. But once all the players have completed all their rounds of play, the lead player has announced that's it, we're not doing any more rounds, then we are almost at the end of the year. The attack phase is over, and we go into the third and final aspect, which is the post-attack phase, again identified on the score sheet. And this is the shortest and fastest. The post-attack phase is where players get to make any final strategic moves, which again is just like a troop movement from one adjacent territory to another. In order to be able to take that final strategic move, players will either have to have a general or a blue strategy card that gives them the right to do so. Otherwise, they can't even do that. And so very often, there really are no final strategic moves that need to be made by any of the players. So that very quickly is resolved if anybody's going to make one final strategic move, and then the year ends. So the year has gone in 3 phases: the pre-attack phase, the attack phase, the post-attack phase. The attack phase consisted of anywhere from 1 to 10 rounds. Now that we've gone through all 3 phases, the year is officially over. And now that the year is over, a very important aspect of the game is that now the player who was the lead player in year 1 goes to the end of the line. And player number 2 is now at the front of the line. So for year number 2, he will now be the lead player, which means he will now get to determine how many rounds will be in year number 2. Of course, when year number 2 is over, he will go to the end of the line, and number 3 moves up to the first position. He is the lead player in year number 3. So if you have a full complement of 5 players, and the game does play best with 5 players, during the course of the game, because there are 5 years, that means that each player will have been in control of the length of one of those 5 years. I just mentioned usually the 2 best years to control are either the first year or the last year. So if you're the first player or the last player in the sequence, that usually gives you a little bit of an advantage. But at the end of the day, it's always good to be able to control at least one of the 5 years. Now that we've completed year 1 and the player who was at the front has moved to the end of the line here, and then we begin year 2, and so we return to the score sheet we flip it over to the scorekeeping side. We're here at the beginning of year 2, and again we use the formula to calculate how many bonus points we gained. Did we gain control of a complete country, for example? Industrial centers, total number of territories divided by 3. We'll get reinforcements and currency units again, and the whole process starts over with the pre-attack phase. All right, so that's a basic overview of the progression of the year. Now then, we said that your primary action during your round of the various years allows the one primary action of either a troop movement or an attack. So let's talk about the dynamics of attacking. There are various types of military units and hardware, and so we'll just run over quickly how you attack with the different units. Let's begin by talking about attacking with land forces, which would be of 2 types. First, there would be your basic infantry. If you are familiar with the game of Risk, attacking with infantry would be very similar to how it works with Risk. The attacking player will use up to, or can use up to 3 dice, as long as he has at least 4 infantry cubes in the territory that he's attacking from. I say 4 because he must always be prepared to have 1 player left behind, and then the 3 dice means that if he wins the battle, he'll have to move in at least 3 units. So just as in Risk, he will roll 3 dice. Now the defender will roll 2 6-sided dice with these land forces, and he must roll the maximum of 2 dice until he is down to his final troop. If he only has 1 troop left here in the territory, then he would roll only 1 die, because a player can never roll more dice than the number of units that he has to attack or defend with. But the defender has no option about that, well, am I going to roll 2 or 1 dice this time? He has to roll 2 if he has at least 2 units that he can lose on the board. So land forces attacking with the 6-sided dice. And again, we say this is like Risk in terms of settling the battle, because the attacker will simply compare his 2 best rolls out of the 3 dice with the 2 rolls of the defender, and his highest die beats the defender's highest die, and his next highest die will beat or lose to the defender's next highest die. And so it could be that when the attacker throws 3 dice, 2 of his dice are higher than the defender's 2 dice, and so the defender loses 2 units off the board. These are simply removed and returned to his bag of cubes. It might be that the attacker loses 1 and the defender loses 1, type of thing. So you battle like this until either the attacker has won enough throws with the dice that all of the defender's cubes are removed from the board, or the attacker is not able to defeat him, and the attack simply has to come to an end and he has to withdraw the attack. If he then wins the attack, as we said, he must move in at least as many cubes as the number of dice he rolled. Usually he rolled all 3 dice because that gives him the maximum advantage, so he'd have to be able to move in 3 cubes. Now, he doesn't have to roll 3. If he wants to throw only 2 dice against the defender, he can do that, and that way he would only have to move in 2 cubes. Correspondingly, if he rolled 1 die, he would only have to move in 1 cube to occupy. But again, that's going to be rare that he's going to do that, because he gets the strategic advantage by rolling all 3 dice. It gives him better odds. There will be the occasions where he simply doesn't want to move in that many armies, and that's when he might roll fewer dice. The defender will never roll more dice than the number that the attacker rolls. So it's the one time when the defender, even if he could roll 2 dice because he has enough armies in there, would not roll 2. If the attacker rolls only 1, then the defender rolls only 1. Again, let me reiterate that infantry can only attack an adjacent territory. Okay, we've talked about attacking an opponent, but now let's talk a little bit more about occupying the territory once you have conquered it. So let's say red attacked blue here in Vador, and blue has no more cubes there, and so the territory is vacant. Now the red player is going to move in and occupy that territory. But you recall that he might have actually initiated attack from various different adjacent territories. He might have done a few throws of the dice from here. He might have attacked from over here a few times, and he might have attacked over here. So where does he move in forces from in order to attack, in order to occupy Vador? Well, the forces that he moves in to occupy the conquered territory must come from the place where he last made his attack. So over the course of the attack, I might have attacked from here a couple times, and maybe here, and finally my last attack, which was the final winning attack, came from this territory. Then in order to occupy the territory, I must move in from this territory. So even though I attacked from different places, it is the source of the final attack from which I move in. Now, there is an exception again. We mentioned that when attacking by air from a distance, a player might send a bomber over here and attack. And in this case, the bomber was not adjacent. So if I end up taking out all of my opponent's forces using my bomber, how then do I move in and occupy the territory? In this case, I can choose one of these territories that are adjacent to his. Only one, but it's my choice. So if the final definitive attack came from a non-adjacent territory, I simply get to choose which adjacent territory I want to move in from. But let's say there is a scenario where I attacked a territory from a distance by flying in a bomber, and I don't have any land forces that are adjacent to the territory under attack. Like I attack Yantadia and I defeat the guy, so his cube is gone, the territory is vacant. How do I occupy it? With land force, I don't have any land forces that are adjacent to this territory that I can move in with. Well, in that case, then I can't occupy it. The bomber will go back to its place of origin, and more about that later. And that means in this case, I wouldn't be able to occupy the territory. I've simply vacated it. I knocked out all of his military forces there, so he no longer occupies it. He can no longer claim this territory of Yantadia as his. But I also cannot move in and occupy it to claim it as mine, because the final, the definitive attack, came from a non-adjacent territory, and I don't have any territory with forces that are adjacent to it. So to claim it and occupy it, I've got to have forces that are adjacent to it. All right, so we've talked about attacking with infantry, where the attacker gets to use 3 dice. And infantry will attack adjacent territories. Now let's talk about how we fight using heavy artillery, which are represented by these little squares. Now, if a player chooses to purchase a heavy infantry unit during the pre-attack phase of a year, at the time he purchases it, he will then place it on one of the territories currently under his control, and now that accompanies his infantry forces. During the attack phase then, when he declares an attack against an opponent, what this does is it gives him an advantage of adding an 8-sided die to the dice that he's using in place of one of the 6-sided. So we said that normally when you attack with infantry, you attack with 3 6-sided dice. But in this scenario, since I have a heavy artillery unit, I get rid of that 6-sided die, and in its place I add an 8-sided die. So now I'm using 2 6s and an 8D die here. So you can see the obvious advantage of having heavy artillery. It's really going to help me outroll him with an 8-sided die here. Other than that, the dynamics are the same. I still roll 3 dice. The defender rolls the 2 dice. And again, my best 2 rolls will go against his 2 rolls. Now, this works both offensively and defensively. That is, if I'm the defender and I have a heavy artillery and I'm rolling 2 dice, well, one of the 2 die will be an 8-sided die and the other a 6-sided die. Now, for every heavy artillery unit that I have in that territory, I get to add another 6-sided die, up to, of course, the maximum of 3. So let's say I bought 2 heavy artillery, and I put them both in here alongside my infantry. Now, as long as I've got those heavy artillery in the territory along with my infantry, anytime I attack with these infantry, I am now getting to use 2 8-sided die plus 1 6-sided die. And of course, correspondingly, if I were fortunate enough to have 3 heavy artillery in there, then I would be attacking with 3 8-sided dice. And that means I would probably crush my enemy. When I am defending a territory with heavy artillery, again, remember I rolled 2 dice, and it would be either, if I've got 1 heavy artillery, it would be an 8 and a 6. If I have at least 2 heavy artilleries in there, then I would be rolling 2 8-sided dice to defend. And every time I lose a roll, the first thing to go would be my infantry units. So let's say I lose 2 throws of the dice; those 2 go off the board. The next time I lose 1, and the attacker loses 1. We do another roll. I lose another 2. He doesn't lose anything. He attacks me again. I lose 1. He loses 1. Now I'm down in this territory, but nothing but my heavy artillery. I don't have any infantry. He continues to attack just like he would with the infantry, throwing his 3 dice, and I throw 2 8-sided dice. But now if I lose 1 of these, now I lose my tank. Right? If I lose 2 throws of the dice, my last 2 tanks would come off. The key point being is that heavy artillery is always the last thing to be lost. So if a player has a combination of both infantry and artillery in a territory, he loses all his infantry before the heavy artillery, which means, in other words, that he will continue getting the benefit of rolling the 8-sided die all the way to the end until he loses those heavy artillery. Also, if I am being attacked by somebody in a territory where I have heavy artillery, if I lose the battle, he wins and he ends up moving in and occupying that territory with some of his forces. Then once the battle is over and he has moved in, he has the opportunity to capture my heavy artillery. The way that he does this is for each heavy artillery unit that I have there, he rolls a 6-sided die. So let's say I only had 1 in there and he won the battle, so I lost the heavy artillery. He gets a chance to roll for it. He rolls 1 6D die, and if he gets a 5 or a 6, he has captured the heavy artillery. It is his. If he rolls a 1 through 4, the heavy artillery is viewed as destroyed. It just goes, it just goes away off the board. But now if he captures it, of course my red heavy artillery goes off the board, and he will then replace that with heavy artillery unit from his own tray that's going to be in his color. In this case, of course, it would be blue. So it now becomes his. So I might have paid a lot of money. 4 currency units is a lot of money, which is what it costs to purchase a heavy artillery unit. But he might capture it, and now it's his. And now he will begin getting that advantage of rolling the 8-sided die. All right, next let's talk about how to attack by air with either bombers and fighters. Bombers and fighters have some similarities, but also some differences, of course. Their primary advantage is the fact that they have range that can be used in fighting offensively. Neither bombers nor fighters have any defensive advantage, however, so they are limited. Let's first talk about offense and the advantage of range. Whereas we said that land forces, which would be infantry troops and heavy artillery if you have any, these can only attack an adjacent territory. Bombers and fighters have range. Fighters can skip over one territory and thus attack a territory that is somewhat distant. So for example, if the red player here has a fighter here, the red player could fly over this intervening territory of Thordia here and attack this territory called Coriata, because there's only one intervening territory. It could be one territory or it could be one water space. So in this case, for example, suppose that here's the scenario. Red player has a fighter here. There's one water space between here and this territory where the blue player has a cube, so he could simply fly the fighter over. So it skips over one territory, attacking that territory. Bombers work in a similar way, but with much longer range. They can skip over as many as 3 territories, thus attacking the 4th one. And because of that range, players always need to be very alert whenever a player has a bomber placed on the board, to be paying attention if you're within range, because if you're not paying attention, he can catch you off guard. So let me give you an example of this. Down here in the territory of Yadot, the red player has a bomber. We can count the 3 territories that it can skip over. This would be 1, this here would be 2, this gray one would be the 3rd one, and thus he could attack the 4th one here. And so you see the player's bomber was all the way down here at the bottom of the map, and yet this bomber can work its way, if he counts it right, all the way up here to the north side of the board. That's a long distance, so if you're not paying attention, he could sneak up on you and attack. So this is the primary advantage of fighters and bombers, is they have range. Now, they don't have to skip those distances. They can attack an adjacent territory. So again, if a player is, the red player is here, next to the blue player, he's got a bomber, he may want to choose to send the bomber over. He doesn't have to skip over those territories. It's just that he can skip up to as many as 3 territories. And that is the longest range of anything in the game. So bombers are especially valuable for offense. Now then, let me distinguish between fighters and bombers, not only in terms of the range, that bombers have greater range, but also in how you attack. Bombers have a stronger advantage when attacking. They're more expensive to buy, and correspondingly, they have a stronger attacking advantage. The way that you attack with a bomber is, once you've identified a potential target and you fly your bomber over there, you set it into territory and say, hey, I'm flying up here and I'm attacking you. Then for that bomber, you would roll 3 6-sided dice, and the defender, in this case, does not roll 2 dice like he does when he's being attacked by land, but he rolls only 1 die. So your 3 dice to his 1 die. Also, when there is a land attack with infantry or heavy artillery, ties always go to the defender. But in this case, with a bomber, all ties go to the attacker with the bomber. So he's rolling 3 dice to your 1 die, and he wins all ties. So this gives him incredible odds and power if he attacks with a bomber. Now the downside is, at any time, if you outroll him, then his bomber is viewed as being shot down. So what if he flies up here and he's thinking he's just going to crush you or outrolling you 3-1, but on the very first throw you get lucky, you outroll him. His bomber is destroyed. It's removed from the map, returned back into the game tray, and that was it. He purchased it, and nothing happened. So that's always a distinct possibility. So he has very good odds, but once he defeats you once, the bomber is shot down. Now, if the player has more than 1 bomber on the board, he could then send another bomber from another location, or he might have even had 2 bombers down here at the bottom of the map, and if he did, and say you shot down the first one, then he says, okay, well then I'm going to send another bomber over here, and we'll try this again, and hopefully I'll get more lucky this time. Fighters are a little different. As we said, they have a shorter range. They can skip over 1. That's the most they could skip over. So like in this case, this fighter could skip over this territory and attack here. Now it's an attack against the blue one. But rather than rolling 3 6-sided die, the fighter now rolls 2 6-sided die, and the defender rolls 1 6-sided die, so it's not as powerful as the bomber. Furthermore, the fighter wins odd number ties, that is with a 1, a 3, or a 5, but if there's an even number tie, that goes to the defender. All right, the primary advantage, we said, is that they are used for offense. But there's another point that we need to make about both bombers and fighters. When bombers and fighters are in a territory where you have land forces and you attack an adjacent territory, if you win the battle and the blue loses, you can move in those ground forces and maybe that fighter and that heavy artillery, you'd have to leave at least one unit behind. But you could move in all of these things with the land forces as long as they were in that adjacent territory. So I can move that fighter in, I can move that tank in with my land forces if they're adjacent. But in the case where I use a bomber or a fighter to attack a territory that is not adjacent, again, back in the scenario down here, where I'm way down here and I fly all the way up here and announce an attack, since this is not an adjacent territory, if I win and I destroy all of his units, I cannot land my plane in this territory and occupy it. Instead, it has to be returned to the originating point where it was. In other words, essentially fighters and bombers fly sorties and they attack from the air, but they can't land and occupy the territory. They're just flying a sortie and then returning to the point of attack. So again, let me repeat, if I'm attacking an adjacent territory and I have my fighter or bomber here, then I win the battle, then I can move in and occupy that adjacent territory. But if I'm attacking from a distance with a fighter or bomber, I cannot move in that fighter or bomber. Now, we've said that fighters and bombers have strong offensive advantages, and they do. But the downside of fighters and bombers is that unlike heavy infantry and, heavy artillery and infantry, they have no defensive advantage. Okay? You just fly sorties with them and attack other players, but you can't defend any of your territory with them. So the way you want to see it is, if you have fighters and bombers in a territory that gets attacked, rather than you doing the attacking, you're being attacked by another player. This is like a Pearl Harbor situation where they caught you with your Air Force grounded, right? And they're just going to pummel you. So when you're being attacked, you don't get to roll any dice because of those fighters or bombers. You don't defend at all. The only thing that defends, and hence the only thing that's ever actually going to be the focus of an attack, would be your ground forces, that is the infantry and the heavy artillery. Nobody's actually attacking your fighter and bomber, okay? So again, let's say that a player has some infantry and a heavy artillery along with a bomber in a territory, and this territory gets attacked and he loses all of his infantry. He's down now to one heavy artillery. He loses that last row with the heavy artillery, so that's removed off the board, and the attacker can capture it if he can roll a 5 or a 6. And now we're left with a bomber, which was never attacked. It's just sitting in here, and it cannot defend the territory. So at this point, the attacker has now won the battle, and he can move into this territory. Well, what happens to the bomber? Well, as with heavy artillery, he now has the opportunity to capture that bomber. And again, he does this by rolling one of his 6-sided die. If he gets a 5 or a 6, it is captured. He switches it out for a bomber of his color. If he does not roll a 5 or 6, the bomber is viewed as just destroyed. Again, like a bomber on the ground at Pearl Harbor, it's destroyed and it's returned to the player's game tray. And that's the end of the bomber. And the attacker moves in his forces to claim the territory. Now, even though bombers and fighters have no defensive ability, they can still be used in a strategic manner to hold a territory. As long as a player has any military unit other than a missile in a territory, that territory is considered his until it has been attacked and destroyed. So if he's got a fighter or bomber in a territory that has no defensive ability, he can't hold the territory, but it's still his until somebody else has successfully conquered that territory. So let me give you an illustration of what I mean. Suppose a player is out here on this island out here, and he doesn't have any infantry here in this territory. He just has a bomber here. Well, that territory is his because he has a bomber there. But unless another player can get out here to this island to move his forces into this territory, the player continues to hold that territory with that bomber. And the only way that bomber is going to be moved is when the player moves in land forces here. Now, let me illustrate how a bomber or fighter can hold a territory even though it does not have any defensive abilities. In this scenario, the blue player has control of this island territory with 3 infantry and a bomber. The red player wishes to attack him from here. Now, we've got a couple intervening water spaces, but that is within range of the bomber, so he can send his bomber over, and rolling 3 dice against his 1 die, he pummels the blue guy's infantry, and so he loses all of his infantry. They're gone and off the board. Now, at this point, because this territory is not adjacent to this one, there are 2 intervening water spaces, the red plane cannot land in here. Right? This is just a sortie, a bombing run. He now has to return to the point of origin. So you have removed all of his infantry, but he still has a military unit in this territory. And as long as a player has any of his military units, other than a missile, in a given territory, that territory remains under his control. Right? Players can control territory with any military unit except a missile. So he has no infantry here. He can't defend this territory, but he is holding the territory. So if the red player actually wants to take control of the territory away from the blue player, he can't do that simply by sending the bomber over. So after he has knocked out the infantry with his red bomber, then what he does is, if he has a battleship available to him, he can load his troops on the battleship and send his ground forces over. And now he can walk right into this territory and claim it. The reason he can walk right in, he doesn't even have to throw any dice or attack. He just walks right in. Why? Because the bomber has no defensive advantage. He has no way to defend the territory, so the red comes right in. But he's going to have to get his ground forces here in order to be able to claim it. Once he moves in, now the territory is his. So at this point, this is when he rolls 1 die. A 5 or a 6 will mean that he would capture the bomber, so he switched this out for a red bomber, one of his. If he doesn't roll a 5 or 6, the bomber's destroyed, it just goes away, but red has now occupied it. So you see how bombers and fighters can hold territories, but they cannot defend a territory. Only infantry and heavy artillery have defensive abilities. All right then, this leads us into a discussion then of exactly how battleships work. Battleships are one of the things that a player can purchase during the pre-attack phase with this currency. They cost 3 currency units each. At that time, when a player purchases a battleship, he places the token representing that ship down on one of the water spaces that is adjacent to a land territory currently under his control, as in this example. So I place it on the water space. Now at this point, I don't have any military units on it. It's just a battleship, and so it is said to be docked. It's not at sea. Whenever a battleship is docked, it cannot be attacked. To be subject to being attacked by another player, there have to be forces on it. So it is initially docked. Now then, during the course of the attack phase of the game, during one of the player's rounds, if as his primary action he wants to do an attack involving his battleship, here's how he would do so. Essentially, the battleship itself does not directly attack. It is more just a medium of transporting the other military units that do the actual attacking. So again, you want to think of a battleship as primarily actually just a transport mechanism. Now, a battleship can move up to a maximum of 2 water spaces during the course of an entire year. That's a year, not an individual round of a year. Those 2 water spaces can be in any direction, linear, diagonal, whichever direction he wants, but 2 water spaces. A player does not have to move to 2 water spaces, but that's the maximum during the course of the year. And he could split that up. so he could move to one water space on one round of the year, and then later move it to a different water space. So let me illustrate. During the pre-attack phase, player buys his battleship and puts it here next to his red territory here with all of his land forces, where he also has a bomber and a heavy artillery. So during the round of his turn, he wishes to make an attack, though, using the battleship. So what he's going to do is he will announce how many of these forces he's going to load onto the battleship. And let's say in this case he will leave at least 2 units behind. Now remember that you always have to leave at least 1 unit behind in territories you control, because you can never willingly vacate a territory. It may be vacated if you're attacked by somebody else and he destroys all your units, but you can't willingly vacate, so you have to leave at least 1 there. But in this case, say he leaves his 2 infantry units behind, he can board his other 3 infantry units in this ship, as well as his bomber and his heavy artillery. These can all be transported by the battleship. And on this particular round, he moves from this water space to this water space. Now, this water space is adjacent to this island territory where the blue player has units. And so now from this position, he can attack the blue player. And of course, he'll have the advantage of rolling an 8-sided die if he's attacking with his infantry, because he has the heavy artillery. Or he could just send his bomber from off the ship over here, knock those out, and then move in and claim some forces. So let's say he does attack and he knocks out all 3 of the blue infantry forces. And he says, okay, now I'm going to move in a couple, or say 3 infantry forces to occupy the island. But he still has his bomber and his heavy artillery left on the ship. That was his primary action for the round, and so that was his attack. He's done on this round with attacking. Excuse me. But now on the next round of the year, because he only moved 1 space from here to here on the previous round, now this round he can move again. This time, he moves another water space. And if blue or some other color had infantry in this territory, from this water space, which is adjacent, he could then attack this one. So you see how he did a total of 2 moves. First he did here and attacked, and that was on round 1 of the year. Then on round 2, he moved to another water space, and from here he attacked this territory. That's his maximum 2 water spaces. He cannot move or utilize the battleship anymore for the remainder of this particular year. Now, let's go back to here. When he had attacked the blue, if he wins, as we said, he moves in his forces and he occupies. But suppose he keeps attacking and he loses the battle. He attacked with everything he had, and he's got nothing left on the battleship because the player, destroyed all of his infantry. Then he lost his heavy artillery, so then he attacks with the bomber, and that player shoots down the bomber. So there's nothing left but a battleship here. In this case, since he launched that attack and he lost the battle, then the battleship is automatically destroyed. So again, if he initiated the attack and he loses the attack, he loses everything that he had in that battleship because he threw everything against his opponent and lost all of the attacks, then the battleship is destroyed. Now that is when he is the attacker. Let's talk about the opposite scenario when a player has a battleship and he is the defender. So let's take the scenario back again where a player is here and he has a battleship here next to his land territory that is docked. And let's say the blue player has a couple military units on the adjacent territory. So the blue player attacks him here and ends up winning, so he loses all of these guys. Now you have a battleship sitting here next to a territory that the red player no longer occupies. And since the red player no longer occupies that territory, then this battleship he no longer owns. For him to own it, it has to be adjacent to a land territory that is under his control. And since it's not adjacent to any territory that he now controls, he loses it. In this scenario, the blue player, who is the attacker, can capture the battleship the same way that he can capture a heavy artillery unit or a fighter or bomber. That is, he rolls one 6-sided die, and if he gets a 5 or 6, he switches this out for a battleship of his color. And if he doesn't roll a 5 or 6, it's simply removed from the board and is destroyed. Now, again, the key here is that he only gets the chance to capture it if the battleship is not next to any territory at all that is under that player's control. So let's take another scenario here again. Let's say that the red player has 2 territories that are next to each other with a battleship that is here. Now you'll note that in this case, we've got 2 adjacent red territories with a battleship in a water space, and this water space is adjacent to both of these territories. So let's say the blue player comes and attacks the red right here and defeats him. So red no longer controls his territory. Blue moves in. Blue has conquered it, but blue does not get to capture the battleship. Why? Because this battleship is adjacent to another land territory that is under the control of red. So again, as long as the battleship is adjacent to a land territory under the control of the red player keeps it. Only if the red player has no land territories that are adjacent to the red battleship can the blue player then get a chance to roll for that battleship and capture it, in which case it's either captured or destroyed. All right, now let's talk about how missiles work and how you would attack with them. There are 3 types of missiles. A short-range missile represented by the gray, mid-range represented by the red, and long-range represented by the blue. Short-range means that when you attack with it, you can only attack an adjacent territory, as with land forces. Mid-range means that you could skip over a territory. So again, if I were here, I could skip over this territory of Yantadia and launch my missile against this territory of Koryata. Finally, we get the long-range missiles. Long-range missiles can skip over as many as 2 territories, or again, 2 water spaces, hitting a territory that is 3 spaces away. So for example, if I had the long-range missile here on this island, I could skip over these 2 water spaces and thus launch my missile against this island over here. Now, before the game starts, the treasurer will want to make sure that all of the missiles are face down, with the picture of the missile facing up is what you'll see. And then he'll want to shuffle them somewhat the way you would shuffle a deck of cards, and then simply stack them up in a stack. And the reason you do that is because on the bottom side of each missile, something is written. Most of them will simply be labeled as conventional warheads. So you look under it and it just says conventional warhead. But some of them have something else written. There are within the game 3 other types of missiles with non-conventional warheads. There are atomic warheads, chemical warheads, and biological warheads. And so some of them have that written on the bottom. Now, the way a player obtains missiles is by purchasing them with currency units during the pre-attack phase of the year with his currency, if that's what he wishes. So what he would do if he purchases a certain number of missiles, he tells the treasurer up front how many missiles he wants. The treasurer then simply reach into the stack of the missiles. Let's say he says, I want 3 short-range missiles. The treasurer will reach into the stack of short-range missiles and simply remove the top 3 missiles in the stack, much as you would remove 3 cards from the top of a shuffled deck of cards. You would have no idea what cards you would be getting, and likewise here, you don't know what kind of missiles you're getting because they're all just with the picture of the missile face up. And he hands those 3 missiles to you like that. So he doesn't know what kind of missiles you've got, and nobody else does. Now, as soon as you're handed the missiles, you'll secretly look at the bottom to see if it says conventional or if it's one of the non-conventional. And of course, you're almost kind of fishing, hoping you'll get one of the better missiles, the non-conventional. But they're all useful. Let's talk first of all about how the conventional warheads work. When you purchase the missile, you set it down on a territory that is currently occupied by you with land forces. A missile can never be in a territory by itself again. That is, you can't hold a territory with just a missile. So you have to put it in a territory that's currently under your control with some other forces that can hold a territory. Infantry, heavy artillery, fighters, bombers, but it's got to be with something else. Now, again, you may be attacked by another player and he might destroy all your other units, in which case then he could walk right into the territory and he would claim that missile. A missile has no defensive abilities. But for you to be able to claim a territory, you can't hold a territory with just a missile then. It's got to be with some other force. So you purchase it and you put it in a territory that is currently under your control. And once you commit it to a territory, you can never move it around the board. So all the other types of military units can be moved, right? You can move your heavy artillery, you can move your infantry, you can move your fighters and bombers along with those ground forces. If they make a troop movement, you can move them along with them. But missiles don't move. They stay where you put them at the time you purchase them until you actually fire or launch the missile. All right, so now they all work in a similar fashion. Let's start with the short-range missile. Short-range, we said, can only attack an adjacent territory. So if I wanted to launch an attack from here up against the gray territory, I would just announce I'm attacking here with this missile. And for each short-range missile that I have, in this case I only have one, I would roll one 6-sided die. And with a conventional warhead, I have to roll 3 or above, and if I get 3 or above, that is a hit, and my opponent will lose 1 infantry unit. If he has no infantry units, but he's got a heavy artillery, then he would lose that. But again, remember, heavy artillery are the last things to be lost, so presumably it is an infantry unit that he would be losing. Missiles are a one-time use thing, so I throw the die once, I hope I get 3 or above. I got a 2/3 chance of getting a hit, so it's almost a sure thing, pretty good odds. And if I get a hit, then he loses an infantry, and that infantry's gone, and then the missile has been used up. So it's a one-time thing, one shot, and it's gone. Now, if I have a mid-range missile, not only can I skip over one territory, but with a mid-range missile, I get to throw 2 6-sided dice for each missile that I launch. And for any die again that's 3 or above, that counts as a hit. So I could potentially get 2 hits against the guy with the missile. Once I throw the 2 dice, again, it's a one-time use thing, and it's gone. 2/3 chance of getting a hit with each of the dice, so it's good odds, but it's a one-time use, and so that's the weakness of it. Long-range missile, again, I've got longer range. The only difference is with a long-range missile, I get to roll 3 6-sided dice, and for everyone that's a 3 or above, it's a hit. So it's a matter of simply, number one, the mid-range and long range have longer range than, say, a short range, but number 2, you get to throw more dice. Correspondingly, because you get to throw more dice and they have longer range, mid-range and long-range missiles are more expensive to purchase than a short-range missile. So missiles are something that you might buy to soften a target. Usually you're not just going to win a battle with it, but if you've got several missiles, before you start launching the attack with your ground forces or other forces, you might launch a few missiles at the guy, hope you get some lucky throws, and kind of soften the target. Now, in each stack of missiles, that is the short-range stack, the mid-range, and the long-range stack of missiles, in each stack, there is 1 atomic bomb, 1 biological warhead, and 1 chemical warhead. And so when you purchase the missiles and you turn them over and you look at the bottom, I think we'd mentioned that you're hoping to get 1 of these. And these work a little differently than the conventional warheads. Again, they are a one-time use thing only. They still have the same range. That is, short can only hit an adjacent territory. Mid-range can skip over 1. A long range can skip over 2. But in this case, no matter what kind of missile it is in terms of range, long, mid, or short, you roll only 1 6-sided die, and as long as you roll anything but a 1, that is a 2 or above, that constitutes a hit. In this case, the damage is much more significant than the opponent losing only 1 infantry. In the case of the chemical weapon, you can see he would destroy, or he would lose half of the forces that he has in that territory, removing his infantry and heavy artillery first, and then any other types of forces such as fighters, bombers, or missiles. Those would be lost. But he has to destroy half the forces. So imagine if you've got an opponent on your border who's planning to launch an attack with you, and he's got a massive army at your border, and you launch a chemical weapon at him. With one throw of the die, you could wipe out half of his army. So this is where the missiles get really handy. Now, the atomic weapon is even more powerful than the chemical. If you launch it at a territory, you throw the die, you get anything but a 1, you don't destroy half of his forces, you destroy all of his forces. He loses everything in that territory with one throw of the die. And in this case, not only does he lose all of his forces, but once you have then managed to attack and destroy all of his forces, then from the general game components tray, you take out one of these radiation markers. And so let's say that you had attacked an opponent here in Zakor. He had a lot of armies. You hit him with an A-bomb. He loses everything off this territory, and you place a radiation token on that territory. And what this means is that for the rest of the game, nobody can occupy or go through that territory. You can't pass through it. You can't go through it because of the radiation. Now, what this means is that sometimes that's a great way of closing the door of access between you and an opponent. Because if nobody can pass through that territory, they might not be able to get to you. Now, a point of clarification here. When a player is hit with an A-bomb and he loses all the forces off of that territory, if he still controls all of the other territories in that country of that same color, he still gets his bonus points for controlling all the territories, even though he doesn't control this territory, because this territory technically cannot be controlled by anybody, and because nobody else is occupying it, he still gets the bonus. So you don't deny him the right to get his country bonus, but you may have killed a lot of his armies, and like I said, and now made that territory permanently impassable for the rest of the game. The third type of non-conventional warhead would be the biological warhead, and the way the biological warhead works is, again, you designate one of the territories in a given country. You launch that missile at that territory. So again, let's say that Red has a short-range missile here and launches it against the yellow territory of Vador. He rolls and gets a 2. And so that's anything but a 1, so that counts as a hit. And in this case, what would happen now is the player in the yellow territory would have to lose 1 infantry troop off of each of the territories in the entire country. So again, in this case, he's losing more than just 1 infantry. He's losing 1 off of each of the countries there. So he needs to make sure that he's holding his territories with more than just 1 infantry troop in the event that he gets hit with a biological weapon. Otherwise, you could cause him to lose control of all the territories. So that's how the missiles work in this game. All right, and now we've walked through all the dynamics of attacking and defending, because we've talked about how to attack with infantry and heavy artillery, which are land forces. And again, in summary, they attack adjacent territories, similar to like in Risk. Then we talked about bombers and fighters that have range. They fly sorties if they're attacking from a distance. But if they attack from a distance, meaning a non-adjacent territory, they cannot occupy the territory thus attacked. They have to return to the point of origin. And then we talked about attacking with battleships and with missiles. Now let's talk about a few other features on the map that will come into play in the course of the game. I'll observe that during the initial setup phase of the game, some of the territories have mountain markers on them. What does that mean? Well, if you control a territory that has a mountain marker on it, that gives you a strong advantage both offensively and defensively. when you're attacking or being attacked in that mountain territory, you would add 1 to whatever your high die is. So let's say you're attacking another player and you throw your 3 dice and your highest die was a 6. Well, normally that would be your highest throw, a 6. But because you're attacking from a mountain, you add 1 to that and it actually becomes a 7. And so you can see what a strong advantage that is at either attacking from a mountain or if you're defending. Again, whatever your highest die is of the 2 die you throw in defense, you would add 1 to that. So mountains are very valuable. Now, that same dynamic, however, also works when a player is attacking by means of a battleship against a land territory. The person attacking from sea is at a disadvantage. So anytime a battleship attacks a land territory, the land territory that is being attacked gets to add 1 to whatever his high die is as he is defending that territory. Now, what would happen if, say, that a battleship is attacking not only a land territory, but a land territory that has a mountain? Well, this is like 2 steps up. Because not only is he going against, from sea to land, but also up to the mountain. In this case, then, the defender of this land territory would add 2 to his high die. So that's a tremendous advantage. So if you're going to attack by sea, it's a little bit tough attacking by land, but it can be done. But you're at a disadvantage, is like the guys attacking under Normandy or getting a lot of fire, right, from above the cliffs there. But if you are trying to attack from sea against a mountainous territory, now you're at an extreme disadvantage. And so this is where the defender would add 2 to his high die. So mountains are very valuable. So one of the things that you're going to be looking at during the initial setup phase of the game is not only claiming territories, but claiming territories with mountains, because they're easy to both defend and attack from. All right, other features of the map. We had already talked about factories or the industrial centers. The way that these work, as we said, is if you control a territory that has one of these in it, then you get that many points at the beginning of each year when you're adding up your points in order to see how many reinforcements and how much currency you get. So you're going to have those on the board. Next, let's talk about these raw materials tokens, and there are 4 types of raw materials. You're going to have minerals, and then you're going to have food, and then you're going to have the various metals, and finally you would have fuel here on the board. So these were randomly distributed on various territories at the setup phase of the game. Now, during the course of the game, if you attack and successfully occupy a territory that has one of those raw material tokens in it, then at that point, when you have attacked it, you will correspondingly receive one of the cards that the treasurer will give you from the general components tray. So the token stays on the board, but you get the corresponding card. Now, there are 3 cards in each color, 3 cards for each type of resource. Once all 12 cards have been claimed, no more can be claimed. Now, why do you want to conquer territories that have these tokens and be given these cards? Well, because if you can get one complete set of one of each, that is right, you're going to have to get one of the blue ones, one green, one yellow, and one purple, right? You conquer a territory that has one of each of these, you get a full set of 4 different cards. Then once you get those 4 cards, you can, whenever you want, trade those in, even if it's not your turn. Literally at any point in the game, you can trade those in for your choice of 10 currency units or 12 infantry units. Be honest, most of the time people take the money. They feel they can do a lot more with the money than they can with the infantry units. 12 infantry is a lot of infantry, but 10 currency is also a lot of currency. And so folks usually do that. So at any point in the game, even if it's not your turn, somebody else is taking his turn attacking you, for example. And so at that point you decide, I need a little help defensively. I'm going to cash in my set of 4 cards, and I'm going to get some currency units. And this is the one exception during the game where, even though it would not be the pre-attack phase, at that point that you get the money, you can immediately spend that money. And so you might purchase some strategy cards, or you might purchase a tank, or whatever you want to purchase with that money. So it becomes a pretty important feature of the game for players to be paying attention to where these different raw material tokens are distributed on the map. And then while you're playing, not only are you trying to conquer territories and defeat your enemy, you're also keeping an eye on where are the raw materials, and can I conquer those territories in particular. Now here, a point of clarification. You only get one of the cards if you conquer one of those territories during the course of the game doing attacks. That is, during the initial setup phase of the game, when you're doing the territory grabs where everybody's claiming territories, you can't simply claim a territory that has one of those tokens on it and say, okay, now I get a card because I claimed that. No, because that was a freebie at the start of the game. You didn't have to work for that. You just claimed it. And so that does not count. And so again, that becomes a part of the strategic thinking at the beginning of the game, because it is to your advantage to get all the territories of a certain color. Let us say, hypothetically, for example, a player says, I want to get all of the red territories here so I can get the 8 bonus points for controlling all red. So at the beginning of the game, when you're claiming territories, you might be trying to claim all the red territories. But you're also thinking, I want to get a complete set of raw materials, and to do that, I need to get this fuel. I need one of the fuel, and this is the only one that's anywhere close to my red territories. Well, the problem is, during the setup phase of the game, if I claim this territory, I don't get a card for that. And I can't conquer myself. So how am I going to get that card? So even though I would like to claim all of the red territories, I might purposely not claim that territory, leave it open, and let some other player claim that territory. Then, once we get into year 1 and the attack phase, and I actually start attacking, I might then attack him. That will give me control of the 1 red territory I didn't have under my control. And now that I conquered the territory, I get to claim the card. So sometimes it becomes a strategic decision, a choice. Do I want to claim all the red territories, or do I want to purposely not claim this one, so I'll have the option later of conquering that territory? And again, here's where some deal making can go on in the game. There might be another player who wants to be able to conquer this territory so he can get the card. So the other player, he doesn't want to claim it either. He wants you to claim it. So you might make a deal in the game. You might say something like this. You might say, all right, I'll tell you what we'll do here. I'll claim this territory up front, but we have a deal that during the first year of the game, you will attack this territory, and when you attack, I'll surrender. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment, but I'll surrender, so it's not even going to cost anything. I'm just going to give it to you, and you walk right in. Now you have conquered it. You get the card for that. But you agree you will only move in 1 and only 1 of your infantry units. Then when it becomes my turn, I will come back and attack you. And you agree that you will surrender to me and not make me fight for it. And now now I get the card. So we just made a deal here. I'll surrender to you. You surrender to me. We'll both get what we want. We both get one of the cards. So that's an example of some of the deal making that often goes on in the game. This is how you have to think strategically about that. So that's what those are. So we've talked about the mountains. We've talked about the raw materials, and we've talked about the industrial centers. There's one last key component of the map that was put on the map randomly during the initial setup phase, and that is these pieces that represent sites of historic significance. What that means is that if you control a territory that has one of these markers on it and another player attacks that territory, at that point you can call for a meeting of the council. Now, what is the council? We hadn't talked about that yet, but all players in the game are members of a council, somewhat like the United Nations. And at any point during the game, a player can call for the meeting of the council. And the player who convenes the council puts forth a resolution. In this case, his resolution would be that we're asking the council to charge that attacking player with a war crime for destroying a site of historic significance. That's a war crime. That should be a protected heritage site. But this other player just ruthlessly attacked that territory, knowing that historic site was there. And so the council can choose to designate him as a war criminal. And if so, then there would be a point penalty. In this case, the point penalty would be 4 points off of his final score. So that's what historic sites do, is they give you the opportunity to slap somebody with a war crime. Now, the council may vote not to give the guy the penalty, so he might get away with it. But at least you get the option of calling the council and asking them to give him the war crime. Now, there is something else that will be added to the board during the setup phase of the game that we didn't talk about. At the beginning of the game, when all the territories have been claimed, there are 2 additional items that players will add to the board. First of all, there is the token that marks his headquarters. All right, after he's claimed territories, one of the territories under his control will be his headquarters. He chooses whichever one he wants. He simply puts the token there, and that is his headquarters. And what that means is that when somebody attacks that territory, he's defending with 2 dice. And one of those 2 die will be the 7-sided die, which you remember is really a 6-sided die, but the 1 counts as a 7. So he would defend with 2 dice when attacked, a regular 6-sided die, and the other would be counted as his 7-sided die. So it just gives him a little bit of a defensive advantage. No offensive advantage, only the defensive advantage. Now, if a player attacks a territory where somebody has his headquarters and he wins the battle, so the guy loses everything there, then what happens is the attacker claims his headquarters. And what he will do is he will take the headquarters off of this territory and put it on the spot on the board where that attacking player has his headquarters, and so thus he'll have a stack of 2 headquarters tokens on the board. So let's say that the blue player's headquarter is over here in this green territory, and he attacked red elsewhere, and he wins the battle. He takes his red token, and he just adds it here to his stack. He just kind of stacks up. You've got 2 headquarter tokens there. And now what that means is he gets an extra advantage whenever his territory is attacked. But rather than rolling a 7-sided die to defend it, he gets to add an 8-sided die in there to defend because he has 2 headquarters. And if he gets 3 headquarters, the defensive advantages go up. Let me remind you that on the score sheet, if you take the score sheet and you open it up, on the inside is where the score sheet spells out the different advantages. If you end up conquering 2 other headquarters, for example, so that you're sitting on a total of 3 headquarters here, then you defend this territory with a 9-sided die and a 6-sided die. When you start defending with a 9-sided die, you start becoming nearly invulnerable. If you can get as many as 4 headquarter tokens on here, because you conquered 3 other headquarters, you're defending with a 10-sided die. That's nearly impossible to outroll. So there is a real advantage to conquering and capturing other people's headquarters. So you also have that component on the board. We were introduced to the council when we talked about the sites of historic significance, how if that territory gets attacked, you could convene the council. Let us talk about other things that the council can talk about. In addition to attacking a site of historic significance, you might attack a player's civilians. Because during the setup phase of the game, not only does a player take his headquarter token and put it on one of his territories that marks that now as his headquarter, in each player's tray he also has one token designated as civilians on one side and human shield on the other. During the setup phase, after he's claimed all of its territories, each player will take out this token and set it on one of the territories currently under his control, with one side or the other facing up. If the side that says civilians is facing up, that means there are civilians in that territory. If then an opponent attacks that particular territory, he's essentially attacking civilians. So at that point, the defender can convene the council and call for a resolution to give the attacker a war crime penalty for killing civilians. And the penalty for attacking civilians is a 7-point penalty off his final score. So again, if you get a vote of the council, majority vote settles the matter, then the resolution passes, and on his score sheet, he makes a little notation to himself. You'll see at the bottom of the score sheet, there is a place for the player to make notes to himself where he can record any point penalties. And so you see, right, it's a point penalty of minus 7 points. So again, for historic site, minus 4 points. For civilians, minus 7 points. Now, what if a player uses one of his missiles with a non-conventional warhead? That would be the atomic, biological, or chemical warhead. Suppose he uses one of those against an opponent, launches an A-bomb against somebody, right? Whether or not the launch is successful, that is, if you roll 2 or above, it's a hit. But what if you roll a 1? It was a dud. It doesn't matter whether it was a dud or a hit. The fact that he attempted to attack another player with another with a non-conventional warhead means that any of the players at that point, it doesn't even have to be the attack player, any of the players when these things are done can convene the council. At that point, the play pauses, the council meets, and he puts forth a resolution and says, hey, this guy just fired an A-bomb at this other player. I think that makes him a war criminal, so let's give him a war crime penalty. And again, the players vote on that, and if they vote, then he has to make a note to himself on his score sheet to deduct 10 points off of his final score. Now, another war crime penalty could be using your civilians as a human shield. So at the start of the game, when you set your civilian token on the board, instead of setting it on the board with the word civilians face up, you could flip it over with a side that says human shield. This means you have chosen to use your own civilians as a human shield. What happens in this scenario is if that territory gets attacked by another player, at the point when the other player declares the attack, instantly the human shield token is replaced on the board with an additional 5 infantry troops. So these civilians basically are giving you a lot of extra defense. 5 extra infantry troops that will help you defend the territory. So that's why you might put it that side up, because if you get attacked, right, you get that extra defensive ability. But if you choose to use your civilians as a human shield, you are now subject to a possible war crime. So again, if you do that, any of the players, it doesn't have to be you, any other player can see that you've now been attacked in a territory where you had a human shield. So at that point, they call for the council, and again, if they vote, you get a point penalty, and this is the biggest point penalty of the game. If you use a human shield, largest point penalty, it would be 12 points off your final score, and that is a lot of points to lose. There are a few other circumstances when you might get a point penalty based on some of the blue strategy cards that are played, or there are points when you can get bonus points. That happens in particular if you utilize a general and you work them up to the higher ranks, you get bonus points that are added to your final score as well. So, but that doesn't have anything to do with the council. But the war crimes have to be voted on by the council. Let me talk about something else the council can do. At any point, a player may call for the council and ask the council to authorize the formation of an international defense force, What this means is, let's say, for example, that this player is being attacked in this territory by another player. Let's say that blue were next to him and blue was going to launch an attack here against red. or let's say it's the other way around since red has blue outnumbered. So red's got blue significantly outnumbered here. So blue is being attacked, and blue knows he doesn't stand a chance. So he convenes the council before the attack goes forward. He says, hold on a minute. I call for the council. I'd like the council to authorize the formation of an international defense force. Again, a majority vote wins. If the council votes to permit the council, it does not mean that any of the other players have to participate in this international defense force, but they can. It is now permitted. And now that it's permitted, this player who needs a little defensive help appeals to the other players, now that the council has allowed it, and says, would you send me some of your infantry forces? Now, they can only send infantry forces, no tanks, fighters, bombers, or missiles, anything else like that. They can only send some of their infantry forces, but what they would do is they would take some of their other infantry forces that they have from other locations on the board, and they come and they add their infantry forces to this territory. And so now you have an international defense force, and it will help to defend this territory. Now, those forces, once that other player contributes those forces to this territory, they are tied to this territory. They were committed to this territory for the sole purpose of helping to defend this territory. So this player can never move those forces to another territory in a troop movement like you can normally move troops because they were committed to defending this territory. But if he gets attacked now by this player, the first forces to die are not his own forces, but the forces that were contributed to the International Defense Force. And we just abbreviated the game as the IDF. So all the IDF forces die before he loses any of his other forces. Now, again, this is an IDF, so he can never use those forces to launch an offensive attack. Those forces can't help him attack another player. They only help him defend. But this is an important feature of the game. Again, if you get a particular player who's getting really strong and he's attacking a weaker player, the other players in the game are looking, thinking, look, we need that weak player to hold. We've got to keep some balance in the game. So I actually want that weaker guy to hold against the stronger player. That's when he might call for the council and say, hey, let's get together and form an international defense force and send this weaker player a little help because we want him to hold that territory. And so you can vote to give a player a war crime. You can vote to form an IDF. A third thing that the council can do, it's rarely done, but a third thing the council can do is they can vote to put time limits on turns. If you get a particular player who has a bad habit of taking too long on his turn, everybody else is prompt and gets through pretty quickly, but he keeps dragging it out, then the council can vote, majority vote, and we say we put a certain time limit on turns. And so you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do, what your primary action is going to be, where you're going to attack or what troop move you're going to make, and you've got to do that within a specified amount of time. And if you don't, then you lose the right to take a primary action. So do it quickly or don't do it at all. So the council can actually impose time limits on turns, and it's their choice of what they want to set the time limit to be. So there is that. There is one final thing that the council votes on, and that is whether or not to allow the horsemen, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse cards, to be used in the game. We'll talk about those a little bit later, but again, at the very beginning of the game, that's a vote the council will take. The players will all vote on to, hey, do we want to permit this as an option in the game, or are we just going to exclude them from the game this time? So that is the council. What happens in the event that there is a vacant territory? For example, we said that when you start the game, you claim all of the country territories here, but all of the island territories are initially left vacant. If there is a vacant territory, basically, then you can walk right in and claim it. In the case of the islands, of course, you'd have to have a battleship. But let's say at the beginning of year 1, the red player purchases a battleship, puts it on the water space next to a territory where he's got several armies here. So he's got the battleship here at the beginning of year 1. And then on one of the rounds of his turn, he can offload a couple infantry onto his battleship, calling he has to leave at least 1 behind. He moves the 2 spaces, 1, 2, and now he is adjacent to this land territory, which is vacant. And because it's vacant, he can offload his troops onto there, and it's his. There's nobody to defend it, so he literally walks right in and claims it. Now, even though this is not a contested territory, that does count as his primary action for the round. That is, that counts as an attack. Technically, he's not attacking anybody, but by going in and claiming a territory, even though it wasn't contested, that counts as, quote, an attack, and therefore it would constitute his primary action. But it is very easy just to walk in and claim any vacant territory like that. So you will, of course, have vacant territories on the board. All right, now let's talk about the concept of surrendering and prisoners. In this game, if you're being attacked and the attack's not going very well, or you know you're going to lose, rather than fighting to the death, you could simply surrender to the attacker. Okay, let's say in this scenario, the red is attacking the blue player here, and you can see that the blue player is tremendously, again, outnumbered by red. And he says, you know, I know I'm going to lose, and these guys are going to die. So rather than just losing them permanently to dying, instead, I'm going to surrender. So he declares, I'm not fighting. I just surrender. Now, he can surrender right up front as soon as the attack is announced, or midway through the attack, he sees he's losing, and so he just gives up and says, okay, at this point, I'm surrendering. What happens at that point is then he gives his blue components here to the red player. What the red player will do is he will take this red token out of his tray. It's labeled POW, and he will place this on one of the territories currently under his control. He has essentially now built a POW camp. He will then take that blue player's infantry troops, and he puts them there in that territory. And so they are now prisoners in his POW camp. Now, what is the advantage of doing this? Well, and there's a possibility of getting those prisoners out at some point. For example, at a future point, the blue player may be able to attack this territory and liberate his players. Maybe blue comes from down here, attacks red, defeats him, and if he does so, he has now just liberated these guys. All right? And so he takes over this territory. The red POW token is replaced with blue's POW token, but these prisoners are no longer prisoners. Right? He has just liberated them. So they could be liberated. Secondly, the players could negotiate a prisoner exchange. The prisoner exchange would have to be in equal quantities. So again, let's say that the red player here has 2 blue prisoners. Right, this is red's POW camp, and he's got 2 blue prisoners. But elsewhere on the board, the blue player has a POW camp, and he's got 2 red prisoners. So they could simply negotiate exchange. Hey, I'll give you your 2 red guys, they go here, and you give me my 2 blue guys, and they go here. Now they have to just switch territories there. You can't just put them back on the board anywhere you want. They're just kind of switching places. And so, but it has to be in an equal quantity, 2 for 2, 3 for 3, and so forth. So number 1, you could liberate your prisoners. Number 2, you could negotiate a prisoner exchange, and now these guys are free for you to use again, and you can attack or defend with them or whatever, because they're no longer prisoners. The third thing could happen is on the blue strategy cards, one of the card is designated as a prisoner escape card. If you have that card and play it, then that means your prisoners escape, and what that means is you can get those prisoners back and put them on the board any place you want. And so maybe I lost the battle here and I surrendered these 2 guys, and these 2 guys become prisoners. But later, my 2 prisoners here that were here on the Red's POW camp, well, they escaped because I played the card. And so now I get them back, and I decide, you know what I'm going to do with these guys is I'm going to put them at some other location where I already have some guys. I'm going to put them here. So I can put them back on the board anywhere I want. That's the best way to get your prisoners back, precisely because of the freedom of getting them back any place you want. And in the end, you may say, you know, this is a more strategic place for these guys to be anyway. When I had them over here, they weren't doing me a lot of good. So I'm going to surrender them. They end up in a POW camp. Then a little later, I'm going to play that prisoner escape card. I'm going to get them back. And now I'm going to put them back on the board, though, at a place that's more useful to me. So sometimes there can be some real strategy in surrendering your forces to an opponent rather than just fighting it out to the death. Let's return to talk about these raw materials cards. We said earlier that if you are able to conquer 4 different territories with the different tokens and you get the cards, you get one complete set, and then you can trade them in for either 10 currency units or 12 infantry. But suppose that you can't get a full set. Then you say, what's the point of getting these cards if I can't get a full set? Well, they can still come in handy because you might have the card that another player needs in order to complete his set, and that gives you some negotiating power in the game. Now, in this regard, usually any deals made in this game are not binding. You make a lot of deals. There's a lot of diplomacy going on always in this game, but you can backstab, you can lie, you can make a deal and then break the deal with the opponent, and you know, that's just however you want to do that. If you want to backstab them, you can do that. So you make deals, but they're going to have to trust you whether or not you're going to keep your word. But there is one exception in this game, and that is when you make a deal with another player that involves trading him a raw material card. If you give him the raw material card in exchange for some kind of favor, like for example, you say, all right, I'm going to give you this raw material card, and in exchange, you promise that you will never attack me in this territory this year. Or maybe you'll never attack me in this territory for the rest of the game, whatever you want to ask of the player. If you give him this card and he agrees to that, then that is a deal he must honor. He cannot backstab. So one of the additional advantages of the raw material cards is it's a great way to lock a player in, where you don't just have to take his word. He can't backstab when you seal it with the card. Now, there are also some of the blue strategy cards that sometimes do lock a player in. For example, one of the blue strategy cards is a card called the Peace Treaty card. You play this against another player, and it locks him into a peace treaty for the entire course of one particular year, and he has to honor that peace treaty, meaning that you won't attack him and he won't attack you. And so again, the blue strategy card locks him in. So normally players, like I said, they can lie, they can backstab, unless they're locked in either with the blue strategy card or you lock them in a deal with this. Now, then speaking of deals, like I said, you can negotiate a lot in this game. There's a lot of diplomacy that goes on. But the one thing that you cannot do in the game either is trade physical game components unless, again, the trade involves a raw material card. So that's another reason, again, why getting these resources is valuable. If you have a card that another player wants, you can use that to your advantage. You can make a deal with them. You could say, all right, I will trade you this card in exchange for, say, 3 currency units. So I'm going to sell it to you. And so you can exchange this for the currency. Or you can say, I will give this raw material card to you in exchange for a stock certificate. We'll talk more about stock certificates in a moment, but I'll give it to you for stock certificate. Or he might make a deal with you. He say, listen, I got a blue strategy card I think you'd be interested in. It's the one exception when you can let a player know, the player you're negotiating with, you can let him know what that strategy card is and say, listen, I'll give you that card in exchange for the raw material. So normally you just can't be giving your cards away to other players. But again, you can if the deal involves one of these. But it has to involve these. So that's again, it's the only way you can lock other players in. It's the only way that you can trade physical components. And speaking of trading, you can only trade things like that are off board, like currency units, strategy cards, or stock certificates. You cannot at any point during the game be trading military units like your infantry or your heavy artillery or a bomber or a battleship. You can't say, hey, I'll give you a resource card in exchange for your battleship. So you can't do it for military components, but you can do it for the components that are not on the map. Again, strategy cards, stock certificates, and currency, or you can trade it in exchange for a favor. So raw materials are very valuable in that regard as well. Now let's return to talk about the blue strategy cards. You may recall we said that there are 3 primary types of strategy cards that designate when they can be played. They can either be played in the pre-attack phase or they can be played during the attack phase, and there are just a few that can be played in the post-attack phase. Most are going to be designated for the pre-attack or the attack phase. So when you purchase one of these cards, the first thing you need to do is look to see when you can play it. Furthermore, if it's a card that can be played during the attack phase, you'll see that they're also designated when during the attack phase you can use them. Some, for example, are designated as offense, which means you can play it only during your turn. That makes sense, you're using it offensively. Others are designated as defensive cards, which means you can play it only when you are being attacked by another player. Some attack phase cards, however, can be played anytime. It doesn't have to be on your turn. You don't have to be attacking. You don't have to be attacked. You can just literally play this at any point during the attack phase. You can just kind of interrupt what's going on and say, hold, freeze all the action. I've got this anytime card and I want to play it right now. All right, yet another component of the game would be stock certificates. Again, these can be purchased during the pre-attack phase of the year, the normal purchase time. And stock certificates cost 2 currency units each. You can purchase them on years 1 through 4, but not on year 5. A stock certificate represents the delayed gratification concept. So you would purchase it during 1 year. For example, if in year 1 you purchase a stock, you get a year 1 stock certificate. And that means that you cannot cash it in during year 1. You have to wait to one of the future years, years 2 through 5, to cash it in. Correspondingly, if I purchase one in year 2, I get a year 2 stock certificate. I can't cash it in year 2. I have to wait until one of the future years. So it's the delayed gratification. We say they cost 2 currency units to buy, but what is the advantage of buying them? Well, the longer you keep it, the longer you hold it without cashing it in, the more value it has, and its value is represented in terms not of currency, but of infantry. So, for example, if I purchase a year 1 stock certificate in year 1, and in year 2 I cash it in, I would cash it in for 3 infantry units. If I cash it in year 3, I would cash it in for 6 infantry. Year 4, I would get 9 infantry. And if I can keep it all the way to year 5, I would get 12 infantry. In this game, again, 12 infantry is a lot of infantry. So if I can manage to purchase 1 or 2 of these in year 1, and I keep them all the way to the 5th year of the game, that's a lot of extra infantry that I'll have available. And correspondingly, then the later in the game I buy them, the less they can accrue in value. So the earlier you get them in the game, the better. Now, there are 10 of each type of stock certificate, and once they're all gone and purchased, no more can be purchased. So again, if other players before you purchase a lot of year 1 stock certificates, there might not be any left for you to purchase, although that's not usually a problem, but you just need to be aware that once they're gone, no more can be purchased. But currency sometimes is hard to come by in the early years of the game, so it's hard to purchase them. Now, we talked about cashing them in the future year. When do you cash them in? You can literally cash them in at any point during the game that you wish, as long as it is in a future year. That means, again, it doesn't even have to be your turn. You might not be attacking somebody. Let's say you are being attacked and you need a little help to defend yourself. So let's say I purchased a year 1 stock certificate. I was trying to hold it all the way until year 5, but there in year 4, I really get into trouble and I really need a little extra help. So I take this stock certificate, I cash it in for 9 infantry troops. Even though it's not my turn, I'm the defender, I'm being attacked. But I get 9 infantry troops and I put these all on the territory that's being attacked, and that's really going to help me defend it. So it's unfortunate I didn't make it to year 5, but I needed my stock certificate. So that's how stock certificates work. Now, if players purchase these, they do have to remember during the course of the game, before the lead player calls the end to year 5, you have to cash these in. If you do not cash in your stock certificates before the lead player says, that's it, end of year 5, then these will be of no value to you. And believe it or not, sometimes players will actually have stock certificates and they forget to cash them in. And so they paid for these, they accrued additional value, they forgot to cash them in, and now they're no help at all to the player. And so they're going to lose a lot of points. So buy them, try to keep them to the end or as long as you can, but don't forget to cash them in before the game is called. Another aspect of the game are these bridges that are represented by these tokens. You've got two long bridges and two short bridges, just depending on what you're going to need. The way you get a bridge is by one of the blue strategy cards that authorizes you to build a bridge. So if you play one of those cards, you can build a bridge. What a bridge does is it enables you to link two land territories that are normally separated by water, and it can be as many as 3 water spaces, no more, but as many as 3 water spaces. So for example, I could build a bridge from this land territory called Vador and reach all the way up here, 1, 2, 3 water spaces here, and I could have it reach to this land territory right here. So now these are joined together, and that now enables me to attack from here to here. These two territories, even though they're separated by the water spaces, are now treated as though they were adjacent. So I could have land forces here, and from here, with those land forces, I could attack here just as I would attack an adjacent territory. But one point of clarification. Let us say that the attacker has a mountain in this territory. Even though we say these two spaces are treated as now adjacent because I can get from here to here, the attacker does not get the mountain advantage because technically there is still some water between the two. So he doesn't get to add 1 to his high die when attacking. On the other hand, if the defender over here, as the defender has a mountain on his territory, as the one being attacked, he does still get his mountain advantage, meaning he would add 1 to his high die because this is like a regular land territory attacking up against a mountain. There are 2 types of what are referred to in the game as strategic targets that can be attacked by air. The 2 types of strategic targets would be your factories or industrial centers and bridges. Now these can be attacked by air, that is by either a bomber or a fighter. If a player wishes to say attack a bridge, then this is how he would do so. Let's say red player's got a bomber sitting here, and he announces that the object of his attack is this bridge, which is connected to Vador here. So he can attack the bridge. He just sends his bomber over here, and what he does is for his bomber, he gets to roll 3 6-sided dice, and he needs to get 2 rolls of 5 or 6. And if he can get 2 5s or 6, each 5 or 6 counts as a hit, 2 hits, then the bridge is viewed as being destroyed. Now, because he rolls only 3 dice, the odds of getting 2 5s or 6 are kind of slim. But suppose he has multiple bombers. He could send multiple bombers. So let's say he's got 3 bombers. He says, all right, I'm going to send all 3 bombers over here to attack. For each bomber that he has, he gets to roll 3 6-sided dice. And so, in other words, he would now be rolling 9 dice. And basically, he'd have to roll his 3 times in a row. But it would be 9 throws. And out of 9 throws, he might have pretty good odds of getting 2 5s and 6s. And so if he gets 2 5s or 6s, the bridge is destroyed. So that's one strategic target that can be attacked. The other would be a factory. Again, this can be attacked with bombers or fighters. Now, if you say, all right, I'm attacking this factory, again, it's the same principle. If you're sending a bomber, then for each bomber in the attack, you get to roll 3 6-sided dice. If you get a 5 or 6, that counts as a hit. If it is a 2-point factory, you need 2 5s or 6s. If you are attacking a 1-point factory, you only need 1 5 or 6 for that to be a hit, and it is destroyed. Now, we've been talking about bombers. If you send a fighter over, it's the same principle, but with a fighter, instead of 3 6-sided dice for each fighter in the attack, you get to roll only 2 6-sided dice. But again, the same principle, you're looking for 5s and 6s. And if you've got multiple fighters, you use 2 6-sided dice for each one in the attack. And so you'll get more rolls. But the same principle, 5 or 6, you need 2 hits to take out a 2-point factory. a 1, 5, or 6 to take out a 1-point factory. Now, if you end up taking out the factory, then what happens is it is not removed from the board. Instead, the player who controls that factory turns it up on its side like that, and that marks it as destroyed. During a future year of the game, during the purchase phase, if he wishes, he can rebuild that factory. Again, the cost depends on the value of the factory. If it's a 2-point factory, he pays 2 currency units to the bank. Then he flips the factory back up and it's back in existence, and now he can get credit for it going forward. Again, for a 1-point industrial center that had been destroyed, it was turned on its side. During the next year of the game, he pays 1 currency unit because it's a 1-point industrial center, turns it back over, and in the future, again, he can get credit for that factory. So you can destroy bridges or factories with fighters and bombers as strategic targets, rather than attacking an opponent's military units. Now, a few brief comments about a few other features of the game. First of all, let's just clarify that whenever you announce an attack as your primary action against another player in a given territory, if he takes any kind of action in response to your announcement, then you can't simply change your mind. You've already committed yourself. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Suppose one player says he's going to attack the other in a given territory, and so the defender plays a blue strategy card called the minefield. Well, the minefield gives that defender strong advantage. I mean, he's just going to grind you up as the attacker. So you say, oh, I didn't realize he had that territory mined. And second thought, I don't want to attack her. Well, it's too late. You've already committed. That is your primary action. Now, so you'll have to follow through with the attack. Now, sometimes you may say, okay, I can't change my mind and attack elsewhere, but I'm only going to throw the dice 1 time and then I'm going to withdraw my attack. I'm not going to keep attacking. You can do that because you don't have to fight all the way to the death every time you announce an attack, but you can't change the objective and say, oh, well, if I'd known that, and second thought, I don't want to attack you here. So once you announce, if any players take any other kind of action in response to what you've announced, you can't change your mind. Let me also mention the concept of friendly fire. If you are attacking a player, when you throw your dice, if any of the dice fall off of the table, they bounce or roll off the table, if they hit any other item before you're able to catch it in the air, like you might catch it in the air and that's fine, but if it hits your chair, hits your leg, lands on the floor, or anything like that, then that's a friendly fire situation, and you have to lose one of your units, preferably an infantry unit. It has to be an infantry unit. That's always the first thing you lose. You'd lose an infantry unit from your attacking territory. Now, if 2 or 3 dice all go off the table, then you lose 2 or 3 infantry. So you really want to be careful about rolling off of the table. That can hurt you. Another little feature is whenever you get a triple roll of the dice. Again, if you're an attacker and so you're rolling all 3 of your dice, if you end up getting a triple, like 3 6s or 3 2s, then for that lucky roll, you get the benefit of drawing a free blue strategy card. And normally, a pre-attack phase card can only be played during the pre-attack phase, but this is an exception. You just got the card, and you can now play it here immediately on your turn, even if you're not in the pre-attack phase of the game. So a special exception when you roll a triple. Now let's talk about another feature of the game, which is the general. One of the things that a player can purchase with currency units during the pre-attack phase of any of the 5 years is a general. So he purchases a general for a cost of 1 currency unit, and he starts out with the circle that has a 0 on it. This is what he's purchased, and he places it on the board again in a territory that's already under his control with some forces. Now then, during the course of the attack phase of a game, if he attacks an adjacent territory, that is a territory that is adjacent to the one where he has his general, and he successfully wins and occupies, of course, that's a victory for the general. So let's say this territory attacks the blue one. He wins, the blue comes off, and the general moves in here. He leaves a few behind, but he moves in, and that's one victory for him. Now, on the next round of the turn, as his primary action, he continues now with an attack against the blue here in this territory. He wins that battle, so the general now moves in here, and he claims this territory. Now, at this point, he's had 2 victories that his forces have achieved. So at this point, he immediately gets promoted from a 0 to now he is officially a 1-star general. And with that promotion comes some advantages. Now, initially, when he purchased the general and he had the one with the 0 on it, he got a little bit of an advantage with this general when attacking, not defending, but when attacking with his initial general, the one with the 0 on it, he gets to use the 7-sided die. So in addition to rolling his 2 red dice here, he gets to use the special die that is representing his 7-sided die. So that gives him a little bit of an advantage. Well, after he has 2 victories within the same year, at that point he's promoted to a 1-star general. And now, instead of rolling the 7-sided die, he replaces that, and now whenever he attacks, and again, this is attacking only, not defense, but attacking, he now gets the advantage of using an 8-sided die. Now, if he can, on a different year, make another couple successful attacks, then his 1-star general would be promoted up to a 2-star. Right? If he, on a separate year, makes another 3 successful attacks, but this time it would be 3 successful attacks, then he would be promoted up to a 3-star. And at this point, he no longer attacks with an 8-sided die, but rather with a 9-sided die. Right. And that 9-sided die is found in the general supply tray, not his individual player tray, because they're not used very often. It's not very often that players have generals that are promoted up to 3 stars. It happens. So you just share that 1 die for that purpose. But you can see the advantage of getting a general then. If you can get the general promoted up, it starts getting advantageous. Now, if you'll look, again, on the inside of the score sheet, normally you're going to be looking on part of the score sheet that tells you what you can purchase, or the part that helps you calculate your scores. But if you open it up and look on the inside, there's information about each of the different ranks of the general. A 1-star general, what you have to do to get there, you have to conquer 2 adjacent territories. For a 2-star general, you have to conquer 2 adjacent territories. For the 3-star general, you'll see it says you have to conquer 3 adjacent territories, right? But you also see there are these other advantages. Not only do you get to use better die, like an 8-sided or a 9-sided die, you get promoted up to a 5-star, you'd be attacking with a 10-sided die. There are various other advantages as well. As you can see, there are a good number of advantages that the player gets whenever he attacks from the territory that has the general in it to an adjacent territory. So a good number of advantages, and that's why you might want to try purchasing a general. Now, just a word of caution strategically. Generals can be advantageous, but it is hard to get them promoted, especially much beyond a 3-star general. That is because the attacks that enable you to get them promoted all must come from territories that are, adjacent to where the general is on the board. But usually there's so much going on the board that you may have to attack in other places on the board. You can't just keep attacking from this one particular area. This is not like, well, hey, I'll just do a couple attacks here, and then I'll keep going this direction, and a couple more attacks, and keep going a couple more attacks. That's the type of thing that sometimes happens in Risk, but that's not going to happen in this game. So that's what's hard about getting the general promoted, is usually you can't just do successive attacks all in the same area. You're going to have to be responding to other things that are taking place on other areas of the board. And so even though you'd like to attack from this spot in order to get your general promoted, you just don't have the liberty to do that. Also, if you are attacked by another player in the territory where you have the general and you lose the attack, well, then you lose the general and he's gone. So you might have been working on getting him promoted, but then you get attacked. And remember, the advantages that he has are offensive advantages in terms of rolling an 8, 9, or 10-sided die. He rolls a traditional 6-sided die when defending. So promoting him, he can get very powerful when attacking, but he's still kind of hard to defend and protect because he has no defensive ability. So that's an interesting aspect of the game that comes into play. And finally, one more key option in the game would be the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse cards. Again, this is an option in the game. When the game starts at the very beginning of the game, before you get up and going, the council will have to vote on whether or not you want to allow this option in the game. And if you vote to allow it, then you'll vote on one or two ways in which they can be played if they're going to be allowed into the game at all. Either the purchase option or the roll option. The purchase option is the option where you can purchase one of these cards during the purchase phase of the game. They cost 3 currency units each, so if you want to purchase one, you'll purchase one. And then when we get down to either year 4 or year 5 of the game, then the cards can be played, but they can't be played prior to year 4. They would be played only also when all 4 have been purchased. And you know, somebody has one of each of the cards, or somebody has all of them. Anybody can purchase until the 4 cards have been bought. But all 4 have to have been purchased. And then they also have to be played specifically in this sequence: the white horse, the red, the black, and then the pale horse. So whoever purchased the white one is basically going to start it off. If he has the white one, he determines if and when they're going to be played. When on year 4, or when on year 5, or at all. He may purchase and decide he's not going to unleash the horsemen. That means none of the other 3 cards can be played because it starts with the white horse. So whoever purchases this one has the sole power of determining if and when they're going to be played. If he wants to play it, then at some point during his turn, he plays the white horse card. It's resolved. And then immediately, whoever has the other 3 cards, they will be played in that sequence. So even if it's not their turn, all action pauses and the other 3 cards are played immediately, and they are all resolved. Now, the other option that the council can vote on, if they're going to allow the cards, is not the purchase option, but the roll option. The roll option that says in year 5, after the pre-attack phase, but before we go into the attack phase, during that interim, at that point, each player will roll for each of the 4 cards. You'll roll all 3 6-sided dice. Whoever has the highest roll gets the white card. Then you roll for the red one. Whoever gets the highest roll gets the red one, and so forth with the black one and the pale one. So again, all 4 cards will be obtained by some of the players. And then at that point, you will immediately play, starting with the white one again, and in this exact order: the white, red, black, and pale. Whoever has them plays them, and they are all resolved. And then you continue on into the normal attack phase of year 5. Now, the Horsemen of the Apocalypse add a lot of uncertainty into the game. The first 2 of these horsemen, the white and red one, will decidedly work to the advantage of whoever acquired them, either by purchasing them or if you got lucky with the roll of the dice, if you go that route. The white horse basically enables the owner of this card to draw 8 of the blue strategy cards. I think it's 8 cards. That's a pretty good deal. That's a lot of cards. And any cards he gets at this point, even if they are designated for the pre-attack phase, again, this is an exception where he gets to play them immediately at this point in the game when the card has been played. The red horse card would also work to the owner's advantage. He gets to choose 2 locations on the board where 2 of his opponents have adjacent territories, and they must attack one another to the death. the owner of the red card will designate which of the two players is the attacker and which is the defender. It doesn't have to be the same two players with the two attacks. For example, he might at one point say, okay, I want this player to attack this one. This guy will be the attacker. And then after that attack is done, he will say, okay, now I want these other two players over here to attack one another. Two players over here attack, and that's going to be an attack to the death. And so he makes other players attack one another even if they don't want to. So, of course, that helps him because he's making them attack one another and fight it out to the death. You know, you can't withdraw, you can't surrender. You've got to fight until somebody runs out of armies and forces. Now, the remaining two horsemen of the apocalypse are much more of a wild card. Whoever plays these cards, it may help him, it may hurt him. So he may pay for it, but it may be to his own detriment. What the black horse does is the player of the card rolls one six-sided die, and depending on what he rolls, all the affected territories will lose 2 military units. Again, presumably it's going to be infantry if he's had infantry or heavy artillery. If he doesn't have any infantry or heavy artillery, it's going to have to be his fighters, bombers, or missiles if he's got whatever else he has there. But you can see if he rolls a 1, every purple and orange territory loses 2 units. If it's the green, right, then, if it's a 2, then the green loses 2 military units in every territory. And on it goes. Boy, if you get a 6, every single island is affected. You get a 5, all of the blue and red territories are affected. They each lose 2 military units. So going into year 4 or 5, you've got to really be prepared for this by making sure that every territory in your country is well fortified, or this card could really hurt you. Finally, we get to the pale horse, and the pale horse, again, has the player of this card, again, randomly draw 6 cards from the stack of territory cards. And whatever 6 cards he draws, whatever territories are represented on those cards, they lose all of the military units and hardware in them. And so suppose that a player has one particular territory on the board where he's got a ton of forces, but he luckily draws that card, that player is going to lose everything on that territory. So that could be absolutely devastating. But the problem is he may end up drawing a card that is his own territory and where he has a lot of forces. And so again, it's totally random. So this is an option that just introduces a lot more of randomness right into the end of the game, year 4 or year 5, depending upon how you do it and how you play it. And it just makes it a little harder because you have to be prepared for literally just about anything. Finally, let me mention that there are a few special rules if there are only 2 players playing against each other. I won't get into that here in this tutorial. Let me just refer you to the rule book on that. It's just a very simple description on page 30 of the rule book. It'll tell you what happens when you only have 2 players and how you negotiate that.